The lamps of Belgravia flickered like dying stars against the fog-shrouded evening, each golden orb illuminating patches of cobblestone where the hem of a gown might catch, where a lady's slipper might slip. And slip they did, particularly when necessity demanded it. Eleanor Whitby clutched her reticule with white-knuckled fingers, the modest blue ribbon at her wrist fluttering like a captured bird's wing as she quickened her pace. The season's final ball had emptied moments earlier, releasing its glittering occupants into the night air. Yet while others departed with laughter and linked arms, Eleanor walked alone, her spine rigid with the particular alertness of prey. "Miss Whitby," the voice cut through the night air like a blade, smooth, cultured, and laced with something that made her skin prickle beneath her gloves. "Surely you don't intend to depart without proper accompaniment. The hour grows late, and London streets harbour all manner of inconveniences." Lord Halvern emerged from the shadows, golden hair catching the lamplight, his blue eyes glinting with practiced concern that never quite reached their icy depths. 3 of his companions materialized behind him, gentlemen in name only, their cravats slightly loosened, their smiles indistinguishable from sneers. "I require no escort, my lord," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of her pulse. "My aunt's carriage awaits at the corner." A lie. Lady Mortimer had departed an hour prior, leaving her goddaughter to secure a hackney, an arrangement that had seemed prudent until this moment. "Come now," Halvern said, drawing closer. "We were discussing you just this evening. Your name arose in the most fascinating of contexts." His fingers brushed his waistcoat, where she knew he kept a small book bound in red leather, the notorious record of conquests and wagers that had ruined more than one young woman's prospects. Eleanor stepped backward, her throat tightening. "I have no interest in your contexts, Lord Halvern, but they have interest in you." His voice dropped lower as he closed the distance between them. "A merchant's daughter with such airs. Tell me, does your father's bankruptcy flavor your pride or merely season it?" His companions laughed, the sound echoing down the emptying street. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Her father's business misfortunes were meant to be private. How had they become common knowledge among these men? The answer came swiftly. Lady Mortimer and her loosened tongue after too many glasses of sherry. "Perhaps," Halvern continued, reaching toward her cheek, "we might come to an arrangement that would ease your family's circumstances. My patronage carries considerable weight." Eleanor recoiled. "Sir, you forget yourself." "No, Miss Whitby, I believe it is you who forgets your station." The pretense of civility fell away. "Your rejection at Lady Aston's musicale was noted by all. Did you think there would be no consequence?" A carriage approached, grand, gleaming with a ducal crest emblazoned on its door. The wheels slowed as it neared the small tableau on the street corner. Within that suspended moment, Eleanor made her calculation, scandal now or ruin later. With practiced grace, she allowed her ankle to twist, her body to sway, and finally to collapse upon the pavement with a soft cry of distress. Her fall was neither too dramatic nor too subtle, a perfect simulacrum of a lady's misstep, and it placed her directly in the sightline of whoever occupied the approaching carriage. "Miss Whitby!" Halvern exclaimed, all solicitousness now that they had witnesses. He knelt beside her, his hand reaching not to help but to claim. "Allow me to—" "Step aside." The command sliced through the night air, brooking no argument. The carriage door had opened, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the interior lamps. The Duke of Westmere descended to the street, his movements precise and controlled. Alexander Harland's reputation preceded him wherever he travelled in London, a man of ice and iron, whose financial acumen had doubled the already substantial family fortune, whose strategic mind had advised Parliament in matters of colonial policy, and whose personal life remained an impenetrable fortress of propriety. He regarded the scene with cool assessment, a young woman on the ground, 4 men surrounding her, the hour indecent, the location unsuitable. "Your Grace," Halvern began, his tone modulating to respect, tinged with unease. "A minor incident. The lady stumbled—" "Indeed." The Duke's gaze shifted to Eleanor, who had managed to sit upright, her eyes downcast in the perfect picture of mortification. "Miss Whitby, Your Grace," she murmured. "Eleanor Whitby." "Miss Whitby appears in need of proper conveyance." The Duke extended a gloved hand. "I shall see to it." "Most unnecessary," Halvern interjected. "My friends and I were just departing." The Duke's voice remained level, yet something in his eyes made Halvern step back. "Unless you wish to explain your presence here to Lord Whitby directly. I believe I saw him at White's earlier this evening." Another lie. Her father hadn't set foot in a gentleman's club since the creditors began calling. Yet the threat accomplished its purpose. Halvern's face hardened, but he bowed with exaggerated courtesy. "As you wish, Your Grace." "Miss Whitby," Until our next encounter, the sound of retreating footsteps punctuated the silence that followed. The Duke's hand remained extended, an offer impossible to refuse without creating the very scene Eleanor had sought to avoid. She placed her fingers in his and rose, the blue ribbon at her wrist catching his eye for the briefest moment. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, unable to meet his gaze directly. "My carriage awaits," he replied, "and London's streets are no place for a lady alone at this hour." The door closed behind them with the finality of a seal pressed into wax. Eleanor sat rigid on the plush seat, aware that she had exchanged one danger for another of an entirely different nature. The Duke of Westmere studied her with the assessing gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating assets and liabilities. "Where may I direct my driver to take you, Miss Whitby?" Before she could answer, a sharp knock came at the carriage window. The Duke's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, alert, wary. He lifted the blind. Lady Mortimer's round face peered in, her eyes widening to perfect circles at the sight of her goddaughter, seated across from the most eligible and unapproachable bachelor in London. "Eleanor, child, I have been searching everywhere." Lady Mortimer's feathered fan fluttered agitatedly, her breath coming in short bursts that suggested either exertion or high agitation. "When the Harrington carriage departed without you, I feared, but I see you have found alternative arrangements." Her gaze travelled to the Duke, and her expression transformed from concern to calculation with the swift efficiency of a general assessing battlefield advantage. "Oh, Your Grace," she continued, executing a curtsy that defied her substantial proportions, "what providence that you should encounter my goddaughter in her moment of need. I am Lady Mortimer, widow to the late Sir Philip Mortimer of Derbyshire." The Duke inclined his head a precise degree. "Madam, Eleanor, you must explain how you came to be in His Grace's carriage instead of the Harrington conveyance as arranged." Lady Mortimer's voice carried the unmistakable undercurrent of a matron sensing scandal and opportunity in equal measure. Eleanor's throat constricted. The truth that she had been abandoned by her designated escort, accosted by notorious rakes, and had feigned injury to secure rescue, would create precisely the gossip she had sought to avoid. She began, but the Duke's voice, smooth as polished marble, interrupted her faltering explanation. "Miss Whitby suffered a slight mishap near Berkeley Square. My carriage was passing and I offered assistance, a matter of simple courtesy." His tone suggested the subject closed. Lady Mortimer's eyes narrowed slightly. "How fortuitous, and how very kind of Your Grace to attend to a young lady of modest connection." The pause before modest stretched like taffy, sweet, yet subtly diminishing. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Her father's mercantile background had always been a source of gentle condescension from her godmother, despite the fact that it was Mr. Whitby's generous loans that had maintained Lady Mortimer's household after Sir Philip's debts came to light. "Connections," remarked the Duke with glacial precision, "are often less illustrative of character than actions. Would you not agree, Lady Mortimer?" A moment of silence followed, during which Eleanor observed a faint flush creep up her godmother's neck. The Duke continued smoothly, "Now shall we convey you both to your residence? The hour grows late." "Oh, most kind, but—" Lady Mortimer hesitated, glancing at the crowded hackney she had evidently hired. "My driver has already been paid." "Then he shall follow," decided the Duke, rapping sharply on the roof to signal his coachman. "Directions, if you please." Lady Mortimer settled herself beside Eleanor, her substantial frame causing the younger woman to shift closer to the carriage wall. The interior immediately felt smaller, more confined, the atmosphere charged with unspoken currents of social negotiation. "Number 17 Curzon Street," Lady Mortimer supplied, her fan working double time as she surveyed the carriage's opulent interior. "Such fine Morocco leather, Your Grace. One recognizes genuine quality instantly." The Duke offered a non-committal murmur that might have been acknowledgement. His attention, Eleanor noted with a flutter of discomfort, remained fixed on her, his gaze coolly assessing, as if she were a chess piece whose potential moves required calculation. "I must thank you again for your intervention, Your Grace," Eleanor said softly, her eyes lowered to the gloved hands folded in her lap. "I fear Lord Halvan and his companions were insistent upon providing escort when none was required." "Halvan." The Duke pronounced the name with such clinical distaste that it seemed to lower the temperature within the carriage. "You are acquainted?" "Only in passing," Eleanor replied, though in truth she had spent the entire season avoiding Halvan's increasingly predatory attentions. "We share few social circles." "Yet he addressed you with familiarity." It was not a question but an observation, precise and cutting. Lady Mortimer interjected with practiced brightness. "Lord Halvan has shown marked interest in several young ladies this season." His mother, the Countess, speaks highly of his imminent selection of a bride. She patted Eleanor's hand, though of course my goddaughter's modest dowry places her somewhat beyond such lofty considerations. The carriage hit a rough patch of cobblestone, causing Lady Mortimer to clutch at the leather strap. Eleanor maintained her balance with the practiced poise of one accustomed to navigating uneven terrain, both literal and social. Dowries, observed the Duke, like connections, reveal little about substance. A weighted silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic clop of hooves against stone. Eleanor dared a glance upward and found the Duke's gaze still upon her, his expression unreadable yet somehow more alert than his reputation for cold indifference would suggest. "Substance," echoed Lady Mortimer with a titter, "is precisely what my dear goddaughter possesses in abundance. Educated far beyond what is strictly necessary for a young woman, I often tell her, reads philosophical treatises as if they were ladies' novels. Her father's influence, I'm afraid." "You make my modest studies sound quite rebellious, godmother," Eleanor murmured, embarrassment mingling with a flicker of pride. "And what philosophers capture your interest, Miss Whitby?" the Duke inquired, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than mere social convention. Eleanor hesitated. Ladies were not meant to display intellectual pursuits too prominently. It was considered unseemly, a deterrent to marital prospects. Yet something in the Duke's direct gaze compelled honesty. Locke and Rousseau, primarily, though recently I have found Mill's perspectives on liberty most illuminating. Lady Mortimer's fan nearly doubled its pace. "Eleanor, such serious topics are hardly appropriate for light conversation." "On the contrary," the Duke countered, the ghost of what might have been amusement flickering in his grey eyes, "I find Miss Whitby's reading choices reveal more of substance than a dozen quadrilles or recitals ever could." The carriage slowed as it approached the modest townhouse that served as Lady Mortimer's London residence. In the pale glow of the carriage lamps, Eleanor noticed a tightening around the Duke's mouth as he observed the building, noting perhaps the slight disrepair of the steps, the missing finial on the wrought iron railing. "Your Grace," Lady Mortimer began as the carriage halted, her tone honeyed with possibility, "might I be so bold as to invite you for tea tomorrow, a small token of our appreciation for your gallantry this evening?" Eleanor held her breath. Such an invitation, extended to a duke by a widow of modest standing, bordered on presumption. Yet if accepted, it would set Mayfair's drawing rooms ablaze with speculation. The Duke's gaze shifted from Lady Mortimer to Eleanor, then back again. "I regret that prior engagements prevent me from accepting your kind invitation, Lady Mortimer." "Of course," Eleanor thought, a curious mixture of relief and disappointment coursing through her. A duke did not take tea in Curzon Street with a merchant's daughter, no matter how unusual their introduction. "However," he continued, surprising them both, "I would be pleased to welcome you both to Westmere House at 4 o'clock tomorrow, if that would be convenient." Lady Mortimer nearly dropped her fan. "Westmere House, Your Grace, we would be honoured beyond words." "Miss Whitby?" The Duke addressed Eleanor directly, awaiting her response rather than accepting her godmother's enthusiastic assent as sufficient. "You are most kind, Your Grace," she replied, uncertain why he would extend such an invitation, yet unable to refuse. 4 o'clock would be most convenient." The carriage door opened, the footman extending his arm to assist their descent. As Eleanor stepped down, the blue ribbon at her wrist caught momentarily on the carriage door. The Duke, observing this, reached out with gloved fingers to carefully disentangle the silken strand. "Until tomorrow, Miss Whitby," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I believe we have matters of substance to discuss." The carriage door closed before she could respond. Through the window, Eleanor caught a final glimpse of the Duke's austere profile as the horses pulled away into the London night. "Well," Lady Mortimer exclaimed, clutching Eleanor's arm as they ascended the steps, "of all the extraordinary occurrences, the Duke of Westmere himself. Eleanor, you must wear your blue silk tomorrow. It brings out your eyes. And for heaven's sake, girl, do not mention philosophers or that dreadful Mill person." Eleanor nodded absently, her mind still caught in the curious moment when the Duke had freed her ribbon. His touch, though separated by gloves, had seemed to carry a current of intent that transcended mere courtesy. As they entered the foyer, a folded note awaited on the silver salver. Lady Mortimer snatched it up, breaking the seal with eager fingers. Her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as she scanned the contents. "Oh dear," she breathed, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Eleanor, it appears your father's circumstances have deteriorated further." The note trembled in her godmother's hand, the candle's flame casting long shadows across the paper's surface, shadows that seemed to reach toward Eleanor like grasping fingers. The morning light filtered through the thinning curtains of Eleanor's bedchamber, illuminating dust motes that danced like diminutive courtiers above the faded Turkish carpet. She sat at her small writing desk, her father's letter spread before her, each line of his cramped handwriting a fresh wound upon her heart. Creditors most insistent, Halvan's interference with potential investors, banknotes called in prematurely, must consider offers of marriage, however modest. Eleanor pressed her fingertips against her closed eyelids, willing away the pressure building behind them. Tears were a luxury she could ill afford this morning. She had awoken before dawn to prepare her blue silk dress, the one Lady Mortimer insisted would bring out her eyes, steaming out wrinkles and mending a small tear in the hem, with stitches so fine they disappeared into the fabric. A soft knock preceded her godmother's entry. Lady Mortimer, already corseted and coiffed despite the early hour, surveyed the room with poorly concealed dismay. "I've brought you this," she announced, holding forth a small porcelain pot. "Rose pomade for your lips." The Duchess of Westmere, the Duke's mother, God rest her soul, was particularly fond of this shade. It suggests modesty, yet draws the eye. Eleanor accepted the pot with murmured thanks, though the idea of drawing the eye of the Duke of Westmere sent an uncomfortable flutter through her chest. Last night's charade had been born of necessity. Today's visit to Westmere House was something altogether different, a social obligation created by her deception. "Lady Mortimer," she began carefully, "I fear we may be constructing a castle upon sand. The Duke's invitation was mere courtesy after an awkward encounter. We should not attribute undue significance." "Nonsense," her godmother interrupted, bustling to the wardrobe to inspect Eleanor's modest collection of accessories. "A duke does not invite merchants' daughters to his private residence as a mere courtesy. There is intent behind it, mark my words." Her eyes narrowed as she selected a pair of gloves. "Besides, you've read your father's letter. Your circumstances grow dire. A favorable connection, even a distant one, to Westmere could change everything." Eleanor's shoulders stiffened. "I will not use the Duke's kindness to advance our financial situation." "Such pride," Lady Mortimer exclaimed, though not unkindly. "My dear, the world runs on exchange of advantage. Your youth and beauty, his wealth and title, commerce of the most ancient and respectable sort. I am not merchandise to be bartered," Eleanor replied, her voice quiet yet firm as she folded her father's letter and placed it in her desk drawer. Lady Mortimer sighed, settling her substantial frame on the edge of the narrow bed. "No, child. You are a woman in a world that offers precious few paths to security. I merely suggest you keep your eyes open to possibility." The morning passed in preparations that felt oddly ceremonial. Eleanor's hair was arranged and rearranged. Her single strand of pearls, her mother's last gift before consumption claimed her, was fastened about her neck, and the blue ribbon was tied securely around her wrist. "Must you wear that common thing?" Lady Mortimer asked with a frown. "It hardly complements your ensemble." "It was my mother's," Eleanor replied, the lie coming easily to her lips. In truth, the ribbon held no sentimental value. It was simply the least expensive way to add colour to otherwise plain attire. Yet something, perhaps the way the Duke's eyes had lingered upon it last night, made her reluctant to leave it behind. By 3:30 they were settled in a borrowed carriage, Lady Mortimer having called in a favour from an elderly baroness, making their way toward Mayfair. Eleanor gazed out the window, watching London transform from the genteel shabbiness of Curzon Street to the imposing grandeur of aristocratic addresses. "Remember," Lady Mortimer instructed, "speak only when addressed directly. Comment on the architecture, the paintings, the furniture. Display appreciation without appearing covetous. And for heaven's sake, no mention of philosophers." Eleanor nodded, though her mind was occupied with a far more pressing concern: how to explain to the Duke, if the opportunity arose, that her fall had been a calculated performance rather than genuine misfortune. The deception gnawed at her conscience. Alexander Harland struck her as a man who valued truth above all things, who would find such feminine artifice distasteful. Westmere House appeared suddenly through the carriage window, a stately limestone edifice with classical columns flanking a massive oak door. Footmen in the Duke's livery stood at attention, their expressions betraying nothing as Lady Mortimer's borrowed carriage, serviceable but hardly fashionable, drew to a halt before the entrance. Eleanor ascended the steps with practiced composure, her heartbeat quickening despite her determination to remain unmoved by such displays of wealth. The entrance hall, when they were admitted, stretched upward to a domed ceiling adorned with frescoes of classical figures. Marble floors reflected their images like still water, and the scent of beeswax and lemon oil spoke of rigorous maintenance. "Lady Mortimer and Miss Whitby," announced the butler, a silver-haired man whose dignity suggested decades of service to the Harland family. The Duke rose from his seat by the fireplace as they entered the drawing room. He wore a frock coat of deep blue, his cravat arranged in precise folds, the only adornment a silver pin bearing his family crest. His appearance was impeccable, yet Eleanor noted with surprise that a book lay open on the side table beside him, not displayed for show but clearly in the midst of being read. "Your Grace?" Lady Mortimer curtsied with such depth that Eleanor feared she might not rise again without assistance. "How kind of you to receive us in your magnificent home." "Lady Mortimer," the Duke acknowledged with a bow of precise depth, no more no less than protocol demanded. Then, turning to Eleanor, "Miss Whitby, I trust you have recovered from yesterday's incident." Eleanor met his gaze directly, searching for any hint of suspicion or judgment. She found none, only that same cool assessment she had noted in the carriage. "Completely, Your Grace. Your timely intervention spared me any lasting discomfort. I am gratified to hear it." He gestured toward the seating arrangement near the fireplace. "Please be seated. Tea will be served momentarily." Lady Mortimer lowered herself onto a damask-covered settee, her eyes darting about the room, cataloguing each valuable object with the efficiency of an auctioneer. Eleanor chose a chair positioned slightly apart, her posture straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. "Your home is quite magnificent, Your Grace," Lady Mortimer began, adhering to her own advice about appropriate compliments. "The plasterwork on the ceiling is particularly fine. 18th century, is it not?" "Adam," the Duke confirmed without looking upward, "though I confess architecture holds limited interest for me, beyond function and proportion." A momentary silence fell, during which Eleanor noticed that the book on the side table was Mill's On Liberty, the very work she had mentioned in the carriage. Coincidence, surely, yet the sight of it sent a small shock of recognition through her. The butler returned with a tea service so elaborate that Eleanor feared touching any part of it. Delicate porcelain cups painted with gold rims, silver tongs for the sugar, and a cream pitcher shaped like a swan all suggested wealth so secure it need not announce itself. "You prefer lemon to milk, I believe, Miss Whitby?" the Duke inquired as the butler poured. Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Yes, Your Grace, though I don't recall mentioning—" "You did not," he confirmed, a fleeting something, perhaps amusement, crossing his features. "However, I observed your preference at Lady Harrington's musical last month. You were seated near the window and declined cream twice when offered." Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks. The idea that the Duke of Westmere, known for his aloofness in society, had observed her closely enough to note such a detail was discomforting. More unsettling still was the revelation that he had been aware of her existence long before their encounter outside Berkeley Square. "Your Grace has a remarkable memory for detail," she managed, accepting the cup with steady hands despite her inner turbulence. "In business and diplomacy, Miss Whitby, details often reveal what words conceal." The statement hung in the air between them, laden with implication. Eleanor felt a prickle of awareness travel along her spine. Did he suspect her fall had been contrived? Was this elegant tea setting merely the prelude to an accusation? Lady Mortimer, oblivious to the undercurrents, launched into a detailed account of her late husband's distant connection to the Earl of Pembroke, a tedious genealogical journey that Eleanor had endured countless times at dinner tables across London. The Duke listened with perfect courtesy, offering appropriate responses at intervals, yet Eleanor noticed his attention remained fixed elsewhere, specifically on the blue ribbon at her wrist, which she had unconsciously begun to twist between her fingers. "Lady Mortimer," he said during a momentary pause in her recitation, "I wonder if you might indulge me by examining the portrait in the gallery, my late mother's likeness, painted by Lawrence. I would value a lady's opinion on whether the restoration has altered her countenance." It was a transparent dismissal, yet delivered with such smooth assurance that Lady Mortimer rose immediately, beaming at the implied confidence in her artistic judgment. "I should be most honored, Your Grace. Lawrence, you say? I've always maintained that he captured feminine dignity better than Romney, though some might disagree." A footman materialized to escort her from the room, leaving Eleanor suddenly improperly alone with the Duke. The impropriety was minor. The door remained open, servants were within calling distance, yet the air seemed to change the moment Lady Mortimer's voice faded down the corridor. The Duke did not immediately speak. Instead, he lifted a folded newspaper from beside his chair and held it toward Eleanor. "Perhaps you might find today's financial notices of interest." Bewildered, she accepted the paper. It was folded to reveal a small announcement in the business section. "Whitby Shipping and Import faces imminent dissolution, following withdrawal of Halvan Investment Group support. Sources close to Lord Halvan cite moral reservations regarding certain company practices." The words blurred before Eleanor's eyes. shame and anger rising in equal measure. "This is false," she whispered. "My father has never engaged in any improper business practice. This is because I refused Lord Halvan's advances," the Duke finished for her, his voice cool and precise. "Yes, I suspected as much." Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his. "You know of his methods? I make it my business to know the character of those who move in certain circles, Miss Whitby. Halvan's reputation among men differs significantly from the one he cultivates among the mothers of eligible daughters." Eleanor carefully refolded the newspaper, her mind racing. "Why show me this? To what purpose?" "Because," the Duke replied, rising to stand before the fireplace, his posture as straight as a blade, "I believe we might be of use to each other, Miss Whitby." Before Eleanor could inquire as to his meaning, the drawing-room door opened fully. Lady Mortimer returned, flushed with pleasure at having been consulted on matters of art and restoration. "Your mother's portrait is exquisite, Your Grace. The eyes particularly, such depth of feeling captured there. Do you have her look about the brow, if I may be so bold to observe?" The Duke inclined his head in acknowledgement. The moment of private conversation closed as definitively as if a key had turned in a lock. The remainder of the visit proceeded according to the strictest dictates of propriety. Tea was consumed, polite topics discussed, the appropriate duration observed. As they prepared to depart, the Duke addressed Lady Mortimer. "I would be honoured if you and Miss Whitby would attend the small gathering I am hosting this Friday evening. A musical recital, followed by light refreshment. Nothing elaborate, merely 20 or so particular acquaintances." Lady Mortimer nearly vibrated with excitement. "We should be delighted, Your Grace. Absolutely delighted." Eleanor, still unsettled by the newspaper and the Duke's cryptic remark, managed a polite acceptance, though her mind whirled with questions and apprehensions. At the door, as they prepared to descend to their waiting carriage, the Duke spoke quietly, his words meant for Eleanor alone. "The blue ribbon becomes you, Miss Whitby. I suggest you wear it again on Friday." Before she could respond, he had stepped back, the proper distance restored between them. Yet as the carriage pulled away from Westmere House, Eleanor could not shake the sensation that some invisible thread now connected her to the Duke, a thread as delicate yet binding as the ribbon around her wrist. From an upper window, a curtain fell back into place, concealing the observer who had watched their departure with calculating eyes. 3 days passed in a blur of feverish preparation. Lady Mortimer, energized beyond her usual capabilities, ransacked her connections for intelligence about the Duke's musical gathering. Who would attend, what level of formality to expect, whether the musicians were of note. Meanwhile, Eleanor's blue silk dress underwent further transformation, with borrowed lace carefully stitched at the collar and sleeves to refresh its appearance. "The Countess of Harcourt will be there," Lady Mortimer announced, bustling into Eleanor's room with a letter clutched in her plump fingers. "And Lord and Lady Pembroke. Eleanor, do you comprehend the significance? This is not merely a musical evening, it is an introduction to the highest echelon of society." Eleanor, who sat mending a small tear in her evening gloves, glanced up briefly. "I comprehend that we are being shown peculiar favour, godmother. What I cannot fathom is why." Lady Mortimer waved away the question as if dispersing smoke. "Why question Providence? A duke's attention is not to be analysed but graciously accepted." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Besides, there are whispers that His Grace seeks to marry before year's end. His estates require an heir, and at 28 he has delayed longer than most men of his station." "Surely you don't imagine—" Eleanor began, but her protest died as a messenger arrived bearing a small package addressed to her. The parcel, wrapped in cream-coloured paper and sealed with the Westmere crest, contained a slim volume bound in green leather, "Mills on Liberty." A small card accompanied it, inscribed in a strong angular hand, "To continue our interrupted discussion, A.H." Eleanor's fingers traced the embossed title, warmth spreading through her chest at this tangible evidence that their brief exchange about philosophy had not been mere social pleasantry. The Duke had remembered, had perhaps even obtained the book specifically for her. "What is it?" Lady Mortimer demanded, peering over Eleanor's shoulder. "Oh, a book. How unusual." Her disappointment was palpable. "Well, I suppose even dukes may have their eccentricities. Put it away now, dear. We must discuss which jewels to borrow from Mrs. Harrington for Friday." The following morning brought news that cast a shadow over their preparations. Eleanor's father wrote that Lord Halvan had blocked yet another potential investor, this time claiming that Whitby Shipping employed questionable practices in its Baltic routes. It was a fabrication, of course, but mud thrown often leaves a stain, regardless of its foundation in truth. "If only we knew someone with influence in financial circles." Lady Mortimer lamented, unaware of the irony in her statement given their recent acquaintance. Perhaps Sir William might be persuaded. Eleanor, who had spent the night reading Mill by candlelight, closed the book with quiet determination. Perhaps, she said carefully, our new connection might yield insight. Lady Mortimer's eyes widened. Eleanor, one does not importune a duke with merchant matters. One does not, Eleanor agreed, but perhaps circumstances might allow the subject to arise naturally. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of evening that caused candle flames to burn brighter and conversation to flow more freely. Eleanor dressed with particular care, ensuring the blue ribbon was tied securely around her wrist, visible yet not ostentatious. The borrowed carriage delivered them to Westmere House promptly at 8 o'clock. This time, the entrance hall blazed with the light of 100 candles. Liveried footmen guided guests toward the music room, where chairs had been arranged in precise rows before a grand pianoforte. Eleanor noted with both relief and trepidation that the gathering was indeed small, perhaps 25 people at most, all exquisitely attired, their jewellery catching the light with each movement. "The Duke of Westmere welcomes Lady Mortimer and Miss Eleanor Whitby," announced the butler, his voice carrying just enough to turn several curious heads in their direction. Eleanor felt the weight of assessment as they entered the room. Lady Pembroke raised her quizzing glass for a better look. The Countess of Harcourt leaned to whisper something to her companion. She steeled herself against their scrutiny, keeping her posture erect and her expression composed. The Duke materialized beside them, as if conjured by the announcement. "Lady Mortimer, Miss Whitby," he greeted them with formal correctness. "You are most welcome. Your Grace," Lady Mortimer gushed, her curtsy so deep that her knees audibly creaked. "Such a magnificent assembly. We are honoured beyond words to be included." Eleanor offered a more restrained curtsy, her eyes meeting the Duke's briefly. "Thank you for the book, Your Grace," she said quietly. "It has provided most stimulating reflection." Something flickered in his grey eyes, approval perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. "I am gratified to hear it. We shall discuss your impressions after the performance." His gaze dropped momentarily to the blue ribbon at her wrist, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the ghost of a smile. "You chose well." Before she could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Lord Halvan strode in, resplendent in a waistcoat of crimson silk, his golden hair arranged with studied carelessness. At his side walked a young woman whom Eleanor recognized as Miss Lavinia Beckworth, the daughter of a wealthy industrialist, her gown an extravagance of imported lace and seed pearls. "Ah," murmured the Duke, his expression cooling perceptibly. "It appears an uninvited guest has arrived. If you will excuse me." He moved toward the entrance with measured steps, intercepting Halvan before he could progress further into the room. Their exchange, though conducted in lowered voices, carried enough tension that nearby conversations faltered. "Did not recall sending an invitation, Lord Halvan." "A simple oversight, I'm sure," Halvan replied, his smile bright yet brittle. "Lady Beckworth mentioned the gathering, and naturally, as a patron of the arts, how curious that Lady Beckworth should mention it, as she herself was not invited." The Duke's tone remained even, yet something in his posture suggested immovable resistance. "Perhaps another evening would be more suitable for your patronage." A flush crept up Halvan's neck, staining his fair complexion with anger. "Come now, Westmere. Surely there's room for old-school friends. Or has your recent interest in merchant affairs clouded your recollection of proper society?" His gaze slid meaningfully toward Eleanor, who felt the weight of every eye in the room suddenly upon her. The whispers began immediately, subtle, behind fans and gloved hands, yet unmistakable in their cruel curiosity. The Duke did not rise to the bait. Instead, he signalled to his butler, who approached with the silent efficiency of long service. "Lord Halvan finds himself at the wrong engagement," he said, his voice pitched to carry just far enough. "Please see him out." "You'll regret this discourtesy, Westmere," Halvan hissed, abandoning pretense. "Certain business matters of mutual acquaintance might suffer for it." "I doubt it," the Duke replied with Arctic composure. "Now you may depart with dignity intact, or you may be escorted. The choice is yours." For a moment, it seemed Halvan might choose confrontation. His hand twitched toward his waistcoat, toward the small red book, Eleanor realized with a jolt of horror, but a glance at the assembled company, at the social judgment already forming in pursed lips and raised eyebrows, stayed his hand. "Miss Beckworth," he said, offering his arm with exaggerated gallantry, "it seems we have received a false impression of Westmere's hospitality. Shall we seek more congenial company?" The young woman, mortified by the scene, allowed herself to be led away, though her complexion suggested she might faint from embarrassment at any moment. The doors closed behind them with quiet finality, and a collective breath seemed to release throughout the room. The Duke turned to the assembled company, his expression betraying nothing of the confrontation. "I believe our musicians are prepared to begin. Shall we take our seats?" The performance, a string quartet playing Schubert, proceeded without further incident, though Eleanor found it impossible to focus on the music. The Duke's public rebuke of Halvern, his deliberate alignment with her against a man of title and connection, represented a social statement so bold it defied conventional interpretation. When the final notes faded and polite applause filled the room, Eleanor felt rather than saw Lady Mortimer lean close. "Do you see how he defended your honor?" her godmother whispered excitedly. "Oh, my dear, this exceeds my most hopeful expectations." Eleanor had no opportunity to respond, but the Duke himself approached, offering his arm with formal correctness. "Miss Whitby, might I show you the painting we discussed earlier? It hangs in the adjoining gallery." No such discussion had occurred, of course, yet refusing would create more gossip than accepting. Eleanor placed her fingers lightly upon his sleeve, acutely aware of the eyes that followed their progress from the music room. The gallery, when they entered it, was empty of guests, but filled with ancestral portraits, stern-faced men, and serene women in the attire of previous centuries, all bearing some resemblance to the man beside her. "I apologize for the theatrics," the Duke said, when they were beyond immediate earshot of the other guests. "But I wish to speak with you privately about a matter of some urgency." "Concerning Lord Halvern," Eleanor surmised, her voice steady despite the fluttering of her pulse. "Yes." The Duke's expression hardened. "I have learned that he intends to publish certain insinuations about your father's business practices in tomorrow's financial papers, allegations that, while baseless, could cause irreparable damage." Eleanor's breath caught. "Can nothing be done to prevent it?" "That," said the Duke, his grey eyes intent upon her face, "depends on how much you are willing to risk, Miss Whitby." Before she could inquire as to his meaning, the gallery door opened. Lady Mortimer entered, her face a study in conflicting emotions, propriety warring with the desire not to interrupt what might be a significant exchange. "Ah, there you are," she exclaimed with forced brightness. "The Countess was just asking about you, Eleanor dear. Something about your lovely ribbon." The moment shattered like fine crystal dropped upon marble. The Duke's expression resumed its usual mask of polite detachment, yet his parting words, spoken quietly as they rejoined the gathering, settled in Eleanor's mind like a stone tossed into still water. "Consider carefully, Miss Whitby. By this time tomorrow, certain decisions must be made." As they departed Westmere House later that evening, a note was pressed into Eleanor's hand by a footman. The message, written in that same strong angular script, contained just 5 words: "The Fall, Berkeley Square, noon." Morning dawned grey and oppressive, the air hanging heavy with impending rain as Eleanor dressed with particular care. She selected her most respectable walking dress, dove grey with modest trim, and secured her hair in a style that suggested neither excessive effort nor neglect. The blue ribbon, now laden with unspoken significance, she tied around her wrist with hands that trembled only slightly. "You cannot possibly be considering this meeting," Lady Mortimer protested when Eleanor announced her intention to visit Berkeley Square at midday. "A young woman alone meeting a gentleman without proper chaperone. It borders on scandalous." The note specified, "The Fall, godmother," Eleanor replied, adjusting her bonnet before the looking-glass. "It is a coffee house on the north side of the square, perfectly public and respectable. Many ladies take refreshment there." "Ladies accompanied by suitable companions," Lady Mortimer countered, her plump hands fluttering in agitation. "At the very least, allow me to accompany you." Eleanor hesitated. The Duke's message had implied discretion, yet appearing entirely alone might indeed provoke unnecessary gossip. "Very well," she conceded, "but I ask that you allow us some privacy for conversation. The matter concerns my father's business affairs." Lady Mortimer's expression shifted from concern to calculation. "Business affairs? Eleanor, surely you don't intend to importune his grace with merchant matters. It would be the height of impropriety. More improper than allowing my father to be ruined by false allegations," Eleanor countered, a rare edge entering her voice. "I believe the Duke himself introduced the subject, godmother. I merely respond to his initiative." The carriage deposited them at Berkeley Square precisely at noon. The Fall proved to be an elegant establishment with large windows overlooking the square's central garden, its interior appointed with comfortable chairs and small tables set discreetly apart. A handful of patrons, mostly gentlemen perusing newspapers or engaged in quiet conversation, occupied perhaps a third of the available space. The Duke was already present, seated at a table toward the rear, a cup of coffee and an untouched plate of biscuits before him. He rose as they approached, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts as he executed a precise bow. "Lady Mortimer, Miss Whitby, I am gratified by your punctuality." "Your Grace," Lady Mortimer responded, her curtsy hindered somewhat by the confines between tables. "Such an unexpected pleasure to encounter you here. Eleanor and I often take refreshment at this establishment, do we not, dear?" The lie was transparent. They had never set foot in the Fall before today, yet social convention required its acceptance. The Duke merely inclined his head and signalled to a hovering server. "Perhaps, Lady Mortimer, you might enjoy the window seat. I believe Lady Pembroke has just arrived at the milliner's across the square. Her taste in bonnets is widely admired, I understand." It was a masterful dismissal, appealing to both Lady Mortimer's social aspirations and her notorious interest in fashion. With minimal protest, she allowed herself to be guided to a table near the front windows, well within sight, but beyond hearing of their conversation. When they were settled, the Duke wasted no time on pleasantries. "I have confirmed my suspicions," he said, his voice pitched low for privacy. "Halvan intends to publish a notice in this afternoon's financial papers, claiming your father's company engaged in smuggling contraband during the Baltic route expansions." Eleanor's fingers clenched around her teacup. "That is patently false. My father has records of every transaction, every cargo." "Records matter little in the court of public opinion," the Duke interrupted gently. "Once printed, such allegations taint a reputation, regardless of subsequent disproof." "Then we are already ruined," Eleanor concluded, her voice steady despite the despair that threatened to engulf her. "Not necessarily." The Duke studied her with that same assessing gaze she had noted during their first meeting. "I have a proposition that might resolve the immediate crisis, though it carries certain social implications." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I am listening." "I propose a public association between your father's company and my own financial interests," he stated, each word precise and measured. "Specifically, I would announce the acquisition of a controlling interest in Whitby Shipping, effective immediately." The proposition hung in the air between them, its implications unfurling like smoke. Such an arrangement would indeed shield her father from Halvan's attacks. Few would dare question a business under the Duke's protection. Yet it would also place her family in a position of direct obligation to him, a circumstance that carried its own set of complications. "That is most generous," Eleanor managed, struggling to maintain her composure. "But I must ask, why would you extend such extraordinary assistance? We have no claim on your concern." The Duke's expression remained impassive, yet something in his eyes, a fleeting warmth perhaps, belied his austere demeanor. "Let us say I have a particular distaste for Halvan's methods. His use of social power to destroy those who defy him offends my sense of justice." "Justice," Eleanor repeated softly, "a rare commodity in our circles." "Indeed." The Duke leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering further. "But my proposition carries a secondary element, Miss Whitby, one that may prove more difficult to accept." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Which is?" "To make the business arrangement credible, there must be a social foundation that explains my sudden interest in your father's company." His gaze held hers steadily. "I propose a public courtship, culminating in a formal betrothal announcement within the month." The teacup trembled in Eleanor's hand, a drop of amber liquid spilling onto the pristine tablecloth. "A courtship," she echoed, her voice barely audible. "You suggest a pretense of romantic attachment?" "Initially, yes." The Duke's expression remained unreadable. "The betrothal would be announced at a suitable interval, providing legitimate reason for my financial intervention. After an appropriate period, perhaps 6 months, the engagement could be amicably dissolved." Citing irreconcilable differences of temperament, Eleanor struggled to order her thoughts, which seemed to scatter like leaves in a sudden gale. The proposition was at once outrageous and tempting, a solution to her family's immediate crisis, yet one that required sustained deception on a scale she had scarcely contemplated. "My reputation would be compromised by such a dissolution," she noted, thinking aloud rather than objecting. "Not irreparably," the Duke countered. "I would ensure settlement of a substantial dowry as compensation for the broken engagement, sufficient to attract other suitable offers despite the circumstances." The calculation in his words should have chilled her. Instead, Eleanor found herself impressed by the thoroughness of his consideration. He had anticipated every consequence, planned for every contingency, as if arranging a complex business merger, which, she supposed, was precisely what he proposed. "And in exchange for this arrangement," she asked, meeting his gaze directly, "what do you require of me?" The Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Your company, Miss Whitby, public appearances together, private conversations about subjects of mutual interest. His eyes flickered briefly to the blue ribbon at her wrist. Nothing that would compromise your dignity or virtue. A business arrangement masked as a romance. It was either brilliantly pragmatic or utterly cold-blooded. Eleanor found herself unable to determine which assessment prevailed in her mind. "I must consult my father," she said finally. "This affects his interests most directly." "Of course." The Duke reached into his waistcoat and withdrew a sealed letter. "I anticipated your concern. This contains the details of my proposal, including the financial terms. Perhaps you might forward it to Mr. Whitby along with your own thoughts." Eleanor accepted the letter. Its heavy paper and wax seal tangible proof of the extraordinary turn her circumstances had taken. "You have considered everything," she observed, a note of reluctant admiration in her voice. "Not quite everything," the Duke replied, and for the first time since their acquaintance began, a genuine smile, brief but transformative, crossed his features. "I have not considered whether you might find my company tolerable for the duration required. That risk, I fear, falls entirely to you." The unexpected warmth in his tone caught Eleanor off guard. She had prepared herself for cold negotiation, for the dispassionate exchange of advantage that Lady Mortimer had described as the foundation of aristocratic marriages. This hint of humour, of self-awareness, suggested depths she had not anticipated. "I believe I would find your company most educational, Your Grace," she replied, allowing a small smile to answer his own. "Though I warn you, I am prone to strong opinions on philosophical matters." "So I have observed." The Duke glanced meaningfully toward the Mill volume, which Eleanor had brought with her, its green binding visible within her reticule. "Your marginalia suggests a mind of considerable rigor." Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks. "You've read my notes. I had intended to remove them before returning the book." "Please do not," he said, rising as Lady Mortimer began making her way back toward their table, evidently having exhausted her interest in millinery across the square. "I find your observations refreshingly direct. Few in my circle speak their minds so clearly, even in the privacy of penciled commentary." As Lady Mortimer rejoined them, bubbling with observations about Lady Pembroke's extravagant new bonnet and matching parasol, Eleanor found her thoughts racing ahead like horses broken free of their traces. A false courtship, a temporary salvation, a deception practiced upon society at large. It was madness, surely. Yet when the Duke assisted her with her wrap, his gloved hands resting briefly upon her shoulders, she felt none of the revulsion that Lord Halvan's similar gestures had inspired. Instead, a curious warmth spread through her, a sensation both unfamiliar and not entirely unwelcome. "Until tomorrow evening, then," the Duke said as they prepared to depart. "The opera, I believe. I shall send my carriage at 7. Lady Mortimer's eyes widened to perfect circles. "The opera? With your escort, Your Grace, how tremendously—" "Convenient," Eleanor interjected smoothly, "as we had planned to attend regardless. Your offer of transportation is most considerate." The Duke's expression betrayed nothing, though Eleanor thought she detected a glimmer of approval in his grey eyes. "Until tomorrow, then, Miss Whitby." As they departed the Fall, Eleanor was acutely conscious of the sealed letter in her reticule, its weight seemingly disproportionate to its physical dimensions. By the time they reached Curzon Street, her decision was made, though she scarcely dared acknowledge it even to herself. That evening she penned 2 letters, one to her father, enclosing the Duke's proposal with her own cautious endorsement, and another directly to the Duke himself. The second letter, brief yet meticulously composed, contained a single sentence. "I find your terms acceptable, provided we both understand that appearances, once cultivated, may develop consequences beyond our initial calculations." She sealed it with a drop of blue wax, a small extravagance purchased with her last remaining pin money, and pressed her mother's thimble into it in lieu of a proper seal. The makeshift crest left an irregular impression, somewhat like a flower with petals half unfurled. When the footman arrived from Westmere House the following morning, ostensibly to confirm the evening's arrangements, Eleanor entrusted the letter to his care, ignoring Lady Mortimer's questioning glance. The die was cast. Whether for good or ill remained to be seen. The opera box reserved for the Duke of Westmere offered an unparalleled view of both the stage and the glittering audience below. From this elevated vantage point, Eleanor observed the subtle dramas unfolding in the theatre. Ladies assessing one another's gowns with calculating eyes, gentlemen exchanging meaningful glances across the divide of social circles, and, most pertinently, the ripple of speculation that followed her entrance on the Duke's arm. "They are watching," she murmured, adjusting her modest pearl earrings. Another loan from Mrs. Harrington, who had been beside herself with curiosity about Eleanor's sudden elevation in social standing. "Indeed," the Duke replied, his attention seemingly fixed on the stage where the orchestra was tuning their instruments. "Lady Pembroke has employed her opera glasses 3 times in our direction, and the Dowager Countess appears on the verge of apoplexy." Despite her nerves, Eleanor found herself suppressing a smile. "Is that triumph I detect in your tone, Your Grace? Satisfaction, perhaps?" His gaze shifted to her face, assessing as always, yet with a warmth that had grown more pronounced in recent days. "You wear the role of Duchess in contemplation, most convincingly." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. The week following their conversation at the Fall had unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. The Duke had escorted her to a succession of carefully selected social engagements, a lecture at the Royal Society, an exhibition of botanical paintings, and an intimate dinner at the home of Lady Ashburton, a widow of impeccable reputation whose approval carried significant weight in certain circles. Each appearance had been calculated to present their growing attachment as both intellectually compatible and socially appropriate. The Duke had been attentive without impropriety, solicitous without ostentation. For her part, Eleanor had navigated the treacherous waters of aristocratic curiosity with newfound confidence, bolstered by the knowledge that, for the first time in her adult life, she stood on ground that could not be easily eroded by malicious gossip. "I received a letter from my father this morning," she said quietly, ensuring their conversation remained private despite the proximity of Lady Mortimer, who sat slightly behind them, beaming with ill-concealed triumph at their surroundings. "He has accepted your proposal regarding Whitby shipping." "Excellent." The Duke inclined his head slightly. "My solicitor will arrange the necessary documents. By week's end, your family's financial stability should be secured." The business-like tone might have disappointed another woman, one who had perhaps begun to believe in the courtship they presented to society. Eleanor, however, found comfort in this reminder of their arrangement's true nature. It prevented dangerous flights of imagination, kept her firmly anchored to reality despite the intoxicating circumstances. "I am grateful," she said simply, her fingers absently touching the blue ribbon at her wrist, now a fixture of her attire, noted and commented upon by observant society matrons. "Your gratitude is unnecessary, Miss Whitby." The Duke's gaze lingered on the ribbon. "We enter a mutually advantageous arrangement, nothing more." Yet even as he spoke these cooling words, his hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the balustrade of the box, a gesture visible to the curious eyes below, intimate enough to fuel speculation, yet proper enough to avoid scandal. The performance began. Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor, a tragic tale of love destroyed by familial interference and social ambition. Eleanor found herself drawn into the music, despite her preoccupation, the soaring arias speaking to emotions she scarcely dared acknowledge. During the interval, the Duke excused himself briefly to speak with an acquaintance, leaving Eleanor and Lady Mortimer alone in the box. Her godmother immediately leaned forward, her voice a barely controlled whisper of excitement. "My dear, you have managed beyond my wildest expectations. The way he looks at you, so possessive, so attentive. The Countess of Harcourt stopped me specifically to inquire about your background." "The Countess, Eleanor." "Please, godmother," Eleanor murmured, discomfited by this assessment of their carefully choreographed interactions. "Nothing is certain yet." "Nonsense. Anyone with eyes can see the Duke is thoroughly captivated. Why, he barely takes his gaze from your face when you speak. Even at Lady Ashburton's dinner, She fell abruptly silent as the box door opened, admitting not the Duke but Lord Halvan, his golden hair gleaming in the lamplight, his expression a study in false congeniality. "Miss Whitby," he said, executing a bow of precise depth, neither too respectful nor too dismissive. "How fortuitous to find you momentarily unattended. Might I have a word?" Lady Mortimer rose halfway from her seat, her fan clutched like a defensive weapon. "Lord Halvan, this is most irregular. The Duke will return at any moment." "Precisely why I must be brief," Halvan interrupted, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I merely wish to offer Miss Whitby my congratulations on her remarkable ascent in social circles." Eleanor maintained her composure, though her pulse quickened with apprehension. "You are most kind to notice, my lord." "Oh, I notice a great deal." Halvan moved closer, lowering his voice. "For instance, I notice how convenient it is that Westmere's sudden interest in you coincides with my actions against your father's company. Almost as if your association were a business arrangement rather than a romance." The accuracy of his assessment sent a chill through Eleanor's veins, yet she forced her expression to remain placid. "I find your insinuations both puzzling and discourteous, Lord Halvan." "Do you?" He leaned closer still, his breath warm against her cheek. Then allow me to be perfectly clear. Your little charade with the Duke, this pretense of courtship, will end in your humiliation. Westmere does not marry merchant daughters, no matter how prettily they read philosophy or how conveniently they fall at his feet. Eleanor flinched at the reference to her staged fall, the deception that had initiated this extraordinary chain of events. Had Halvan somehow discerned the truth of that encounter, or was he merely firing arrows in the dark, hoping one might strike a vulnerable point? "Lord Halvan," she began, struggling to maintain her dignity. "I believe you should—" "I believe," interrupted a cool voice from the doorway, "that you are occupying my seat, Halvan." The Duke stood framed in the entrance to the box, his posture relaxed, yet somehow conveying barely leashed tension. His eyes, usually the color of polished steel, had darkened to storm-cloud grey. Halvan straightened, turning to face the newcomer with practiced nonchalance. "Westmere, just offering my congratulations to your protégée, though I wonder, does she know the fate of your previous attachments? Lady Caroline, for instance, or the widow Sinclair?" A muscle tightened in the Duke's jaw, the only visible sign that Halvan's words had found their mark. "Your concern is noted but unnecessary. Now I suggest you return to your own party before your absence becomes worthy of comment." "Of course." Halvan executed another precise bow, this one directed at Eleanor. "Miss Whitby, a final observation. When Westmere tires of you, and he will, remember that other arrangements remain possible. I am not without flexibility in my expectations." The implication hung in the air like poisonous smoke as he departed, closing the box door with exaggerated care behind him. An uncomfortable silence descended. Lady Mortimer, visibly shaken by the encounter, fumbled for her smelling salts. "The audacity! To suggest! To imply! Oh, I feel quite faint." "Perhaps some air would be beneficial, Lady Mortimer," the Duke suggested, his tone gentle despite the lingering tension in his posture. "Might I suggest the promenade? The second act will not begin for several minutes." It was a considerate dismissal, providing both privacy for their conversation and an opportunity for Lady Mortimer to recover her composure. With minimal protest, she allowed herself to be escorted from the box, leaving Eleanor and the Duke alone amid the soft glow of the oil lamps. "I must apologize for Halvan's intrusion," the Duke said when they were alone, resuming his seat beside Eleanor. His remarks were unconscionable. Eleanor's fingers twisted the blue ribbon at her wrist, a nervous habit she had developed in recent days. "He seemed to suggest knowledge of our arrangement." "Impossible." The Duke's tone brooked no argument. "The terms are known only to us and your father." "Then perhaps he simply deduced the likelihood of such an arrangement," Eleanor persisted. "It is, after all, a logical conclusion given the circumstances." The Duke studied her face, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Does it trouble you so deeply? The perception that our attachment might be founded on practical considerations rather than romantic sentiment?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. In truth, she had scarcely allowed herself to consider how their arrangement might appear to others, or to herself, in moments of unguarded reflection. The opera, the shared philosophical discussions, the quiet comfort of his presence at her side, all had begun to blur the clear boundaries between pretense and reality. "I am a merchant's daughter, Your Grace," she replied at last, her voice steady despite the tumult within. "Practical considerations have governed my life since childhood. It would be hypocritical to affect dismay at their application to matters of the heart. Pragmatic as always, Miss Whitby." The ghost of a smile crossed his features. "Yet I find myself curious. Had we met under different circumstances, without the complications of Halvan's interference or your father's financial distress, might you have considered me as a suitor on my own merits?" The directness of the question startled her. "I hardly know how to answer that, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected gently. "If we are to convince society of our attachment, perhaps you might begin using my given name, at least in private." "Alexander," she repeated, the name unfamiliar on her tongue yet somehow fitting, strong and classical, like the man himself. "To answer your question, had we met at a musical or a lecture, I might have found your conversation stimulating, but would never have presumed that such conversations could lead to courtship. The gap in our stations would have precluded such presumption." "Always so rational," he murmured, his gaze intent upon her face. "Yet I wonder if rationality alone guides your actions, Eleanor." Her name in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her veins. "What else might guide me, your Alexander? Perhaps the same impulse that led you to feign injury that night outside Berkeley Square." His words were soft, yet they struck Eleanor like a physical blow. The instinct for self-preservation disguised as coincidence, the calculated risk. Eleanor's breath caught. "You knew?" "Not immediately," he admitted, "but certain inconsistencies became apparent upon reflection. The precision of your fall, the absence of actual injury, the convenient timing of my arrival. Shame and indignation warred within her breast. You must think me terribly deceitful. On the contrary, his hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the balustrade, the warmth of his touch penetrating even through their gloves. I think you remarkably resourceful. Faced with genuine threat, you created an opportunity for escape that preserved both your safety and your dignity. It was elegantly done. The compliment, unexpected and sincere, displaced her prepared defenses. Then you are not angry about the deception. How could I be? A rare smile transformed his austere features. Had you not fallen at precisely that moment, in precisely that way, we would not be sitting here now, would we? The simplicity of this observation struck Eleanor with unexpected force. Their entire connection, the shared conversations about Mill and Rousseau, the quiet walks through exhibition halls, the growing ease between them, all stemmed from that single moment of calculated risk. I suppose not, she conceded, returning his smile with one of her own. The theatre bell sounded, signaling the imminent resumption of the performance. Lady Mortimer reappeared, her complexion restored to its usual healthy pink, her eyes alight with curiosity about their private conversation. As the lights dimmed and the orchestra resumed their places, Eleanor became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere between herself and the Duke. The pretense they had so carefully constructed seemed to waver, like a veil lifted momentarily by an errant breeze, revealing something more substantial beneath. On stage, Lucia's tragedy unfolded. A woman trapped between obligation and desire, driven to madness by forces beyond her control. Eleanor found herself drawn into the doomed heroine's plight, the soaring notes of the famous mad scene echoing the tumult of her own confused emotions. She chooses death rather than a false marriage, the Duke observed quietly as the final act concluded, his voice carrying to Eleanor alone. One wonders if the sacrifice was necessary. Perhaps she saw no alternative, Eleanor replied, watching as Lucia's lover mourned over her lifeless form. Society offered no path that would preserve both her honor and her heart. A failing of society, then, rather than the individual. His fingers brushed against hers in the darkness, a touch so light it might have been accidental, though I would argue that honor without heart is merely empty ritual. The sentiment, unexpected from a man known for his rigid adherence to propriety, lingered in Eleanor's mind as they departed the theatre. The usual rituals of society unfolded around them, nods of acknowledgement, significant glances, whispered comments behind gloved hands, yet Eleanor felt strangely removed from it all, as if she and the Duke moved within a sphere of their own creation. Lady Mortimer, ensconced between them in the carriage, chattered happily about the performance, the audience, the delightful scandal of Lady Beckworth's excessive décolletage. Yet beneath this stream of trivial observation, Eleanor sensed her godmother's shrewd assessment of the changing dynamics between her charge and the Duke. "The announcement shall be in Tuesday's papers, then?" Lady Mortimer inquired as they neared Curzon Street, her tone carefully modulated to suggest the matter was already settled. "If that arrangement is agreeable to Miss Whitby," the Duke replied, his gaze seeking Eleanor's in the dimness of the carriage, "I would not presume to dictate the timing." The deference in his tone, a courtesy extended from one equal to another, sent a peculiar thrill through Eleanor's veins. "Tuesday seems appropriate," she agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "It allows sufficient time for my father to be notified by post." "Excellent." Lady Mortimer clasped her hands in undisguised glee. "Oh, my dear, how perfectly everything has arranged itself. From near disgrace to a duchessa in a fortnight. It quite defies imagination." Eleanor winced at the crassness of the observation, yet the Duke's expression revealed only that same enigmatic, almost smile she had come to recognize as his particular form of amusement. "Fortune favors the resourceful, Lady Mortimer," he remarked, as the carriage drew to a halt before their residence. "Though I would submit that Miss Whitby's intelligence and character, rather than mere fortune, have shaped these events." The compliment, delivered with perfect sincerity, brought warmth to Eleanor's cheeks as she accepted his hand in descent from the carriage. At the door, while Lady Mortimer fumbled for her key, the Duke spoke quietly for Eleanor's ears alone. "I find our arrangement increasingly less theoretical than originally conceived," he said, his grey eyes intent upon her face. "Perhaps we might discuss adjustments to our understanding tomorrow. Hyde Park, the South Path at 2 o'clock. Eleanor's pulse quickened at both his words and the intensity of his gaze. "I shall be there," she promised, her voice scarcely above a whisper. "Until tomorrow, then." He raised her gloved hand to his lips, a gesture visible to anyone who might be observing from neighboring windows. "Dream sweetly, Eleanor." The sound of her name in his voice followed her into sleep that night, where her dreams were indeed sweet, if confusingly intertwined with operatic tragedy and philosophical debates. She woke before dawn, her mind already racing with anticipation of their meeting in Hyde Park. By the window, as the first grey light of morning filtered through the curtains, she caught sight of a sealed note that had been slipped beneath her door sometime during the night. The handwriting was unfamiliar, angular and harsh, unlike the Duke's controlled script. The message inside contained just 3 lines. The Duke's interest expires with conquest. Ask him about Lady Caroline's child. Some arrangements are more binding than others. The note bore no signature, yet its author was unmistakable. Eleanor crushed the paper in her fist, her earlier serenity shattered by Halvern's poisonous insinuations. The reference to a child. Could there be truth in such a claim? Had the Duke concealed a previous connection, perhaps even an illegitimate offspring? She paced her small chamber as dawn brightened to full morning, torn between indignation at Halvern's interference and growing uncertainty about the man she had agreed to publicly align herself with. By noon, she had composed and discarded a dozen approaches to the subject, none seeming adequate to address such a delicate matter. As the clock struck 1, Eleanor dressed for her appointment in Hyde Park, securing the blue ribbon around her wrist with fingers that trembled slightly. Whatever truth lay behind Halvern's note, she would face it directly, with the same courage that had propelled her through every crisis thus far. The ribbon secured, she glanced at her reflection one final time. A young woman poised between safety and risk, practicality and feeling, pretense and truth. The park awaited, and with it revelations that would determine not merely her financial security, but the very course of her heart. Hyde Park in early afternoon presented a tableau of leisure and display. Elegant carriages processed along Rotten Row, ladies twirled parasols from beneath fashionable bonnets, and gentlemen on horseback exhibited their horsemanship with varying degrees of success. Against this backdrop of deliberate idleness, Eleanor walked with measured steps along the south path, her thoughts churning like storm clouds. The Duke awaited her on a bench partially screened by ornamental shrubbery, a location offering both propriety, being in full public view, and privacy, allowing conversation beyond immediate earshot. He rose as she approached, his expression warming visibly at the sight of her. "Eleanor," he greeted her, using her given name with a naturalness that suggested habitual practice rather than recent permission. "You look troubled." The directness of his observation disarmed her prepared approach. "I received a communication this morning," she replied, settling beside him on the bench, careful to maintain a proper distance. "From Lord Halvern, I believe, though it was unsigned." The Duke's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "May I inquire as to its contents?" Eleanor withdrew the crumpled note from her reticule and passed it to him without comment, watching his face as he read the brief message. His expression remained controlled, yet a muscle tightened along his jaw, the same tell she had observed during Halvern's intrusion at the opera. "I see," he said finally, returning the note to her with careful precision. "You wish to know if there is truth in this allegation." "I believe our arrangement entitles me to such knowledge," Eleanor replied, striving for the same calm detachment he displayed, "particularly if it might affect the credibility of our association." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant curve of the Serpentine. When he spoke, his voice carried an unfamiliar weight. "Lady Caroline Ashton was the daughter of my father's closest friend. We were informally betrothed from childhood, an arrangement of family convenience rather than personal inclination." He paused, choosing his next words with evident care. "Before the formal announcement, she formed an attachment to another man, a cavalry officer without fortune or title. When she found herself with child, she turned to me for assistance." Eleanor's breath caught. "Did you?" "I arranged a cottage in Dorset, a modest income, and absolute discretion." His profile remained stoic, yet something in his voice softened. "She died in childbirth. The officer, unwilling to acknowledge the child, returned to his regiment. I have provided for the boy's care and education since." "You claimed him as your own?" Eleanor asked, struggling to reconcile this act of extraordinary generosity with the Duke's reputation for cold pragmatism. "No, that would have been a lie, and the boy deserves better than a foundation built on falsehood." He turned to face her directly. "He bears his mother's surname and knows me as a distant relation. He is now 10 years old, at school in Hampshire, and demonstrates considerable aptitude for mathematics." The matter-of-fact delivery of these details, delivered without defensiveness or apology, struck Eleanor with unexpected force. Here was not the calculated seducer Halvern had implied, but a man who had shouldered responsibility that was not rightfully his, who had protected both a woman's reputation and an innocent child without claiming credit for either action. "I thank you for your honesty," she said quietly, her earlier suspicions dissolving like morning mist. Though I wonder how Halvern came to know of this private matter. Caroline's lady's maid was indiscreet, the Duke replied with a slight shrug. Whispers circulate. Halvern collects such information like currency, to be spent when most advantageous. Eleanor's fingers twisted the blue ribbon at her wrist, a habit that had become almost unconscious. He seeks to undermine our arrangement by suggesting you have a pattern of temporary attachments. Yes. The Duke's gaze dropped to her restless fingers, then lifted to her face. Yet, his strategy reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of our situation. How so? He assumes our arrangement is purely transactional, that you are merely another in a succession of convenient associations. A smile, small but genuine, softened his austere features. He fails to recognize that circumstances change, as do intentions. The implication in his words sent warmth spreading through Eleanor's chest, despite the cool spring air. Are you suggesting our understanding requires revision? I believe it warrants discussion. The Duke gestured toward the path ahead. Shall we walk? Public promenading offers a curious blend of observation and privacy. They fell into step along the gravelled pathway, maintaining a proper distance, yet somehow creating an intimate sphere that excluded the fashionable world around them. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the precise rhythm of his stride, the subtle scent of sandalwood and starched linen, the occasional brush of his coat sleeve against her arm when the path narrowed. I have been reflecting on our original arrangement, he began after they had walked in companionable silence for several minutes. The terms we established were rational, pragmatic, and limited in scope. A temporary alliance of mutual benefit, dissolving when its usefulness expired. Yes, Eleanor agreed, her pulse quickening despite her outward composure. Those were the terms. I find myself... The Duke paused, seeming to search for precise wording. I find myself disinclined to adhere to that timetable, or indeed to the concept of dissolution at all. Eleanor halted mid-step, turning to face him directly. I'm not certain I understand your meaning. His grey eyes held hers with steady intensity. I believe you do, Eleanor. Our charade has developed substance beyond my anticipation. What began as strategy has evolved into preference, decided preference. The admission, delivered with characteristic restraint yet unmistakable in its implications, left Eleanor momentarily speechless. She had prepared herself for businesslike adjustments to their arrangement, extensions of timeline, perhaps, or modifications to the public narrative of their attachment. This suggestion of genuine sentiment exceeded all calculation. Your silence is not encouraging, the Duke observed, the faintest hint of uncertainty crossing his features. Eleanor gathered her thoughts, conscious that her response would alter the course set before them. I wrote to you, if you recall, that appearances once cultivated might develop consequences beyond our initial calculations. I remember precisely. A spark of something like hope brightened his gaze. This is such a consequence, is it not? The line between pretense and truth blurring until distinction becomes impossible. Not impossible, he countered gently, merely unnecessary. The distinction matters only if we choose to enforce it. A passing carriage drew momentarily close, forcing them to pause their conversation as acquaintances nodded greeting. Eleanor acknowledged Lady Beckworth with a polite smile, acutely aware of the scrutiny directed at her from beneath a feather-laden bonnet. When they resumed walking, the Duke continued in a lower tone. I propose an amendment to our arrangement, Eleanor. Not a pretense of courtship culminating in temporary betrothal, but an authentic courtship with the genuine possibility of marriage. The directness of the proposal, stripped of romantic embellishment yet somehow more affecting for its honesty, caught Eleanor's breath in her throat. Society would claim you married beneath your station, she said after a moment, practical considerations instinctively rising to the forefront. Society's opinion holds limited value in my estimation, he replied with the faintest edge of impatience. I seek a partner of intelligence, principle, and courage, qualities you have demonstrated in abundance. Your father's profession is immaterial to that evaluation. And what of my deception? Eleanor countered, needing absolute clarity before allowing hope to flourish. Our acquaintance began with artifice, my contrived fall, our calculated arrangement. Does that not trouble you? The Duke's expression softened into a rare, unguarded smile. On the contrary, your resourcefulness that night revealed more of your true character than a dozen conventional introductions ever could. You protected yourself with intelligence rather than surrendering to circumstance. I admired that then, as I admire it now. They had reached a secluded turning of the path where an ancient oak provided both shade and a measure of seclusion. The Duke guided her to a stone bench beneath its spreading branches. his movements unhurried yet purposeful. "I do not ask for an immediate answer," he said as they sat, a careful distance still maintained between them. "Our original arrangement remains valid regardless of your response to this amendment. Your father's company is secure, your reputation protected. Those terms stand independent of any personal development between us." The distinction, his careful separation of obligation from emotion, struck Eleanor as profoundly honorable. He offered her freedom to choose without the pressure of practical necessity, a luxury few women of her station ever experienced. "I require no extended deliberation," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I find your amendment acceptable, more than acceptable, in truth." The relief that crossed his features, brief but unmistakable, revealed more of his inner state than any elaborate declaration might have done. "Then I shall speak with your father at the earliest opportunity. He arrives in London tomorrow," Eleanor informed him, a smile tugging at her lips, though I suspect his response is a foregone conclusion, given the extensive financial arrangements already in progress. Nevertheless, proper protocol must be observed. The Duke's tone was serious, yet his eyes held a warmth that belied the formality of his words, particularly as we transition from pretense to authentic intention. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sounds of carriage wheels and conversational fragments from other park visitors. Eleanor found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that spoke of habitual concentration, the unexpected softness around his mouth when he smiled. "There is one matter we have not addressed," she said finally, her fingers moving to the blue ribbon at her wrist. "Lord Halvan, he will not simply accept defeat, I think." "No," the Duke agreed, his expression hardening. "Halvan collects slights like precious stones, polishing his grievances until they gleam with malice. He will attempt retaliation. Against my father's business? Against you, more likely." The Duke's voice carried an edge of steel. "Your rejection wounded his pride. Your subsequent elevation under my protection has transformed that wound to festering resentment. He will seek to undermine your position, perhaps through scandal or insinuation." Eleanor considered this assessment with practical calmness. "Then we must be prepared for whatever form his vengeance takes." "Indeed." The Duke's gaze softened as it returned to her face. "Though I find myself almost grateful for his interference. Without his pursuit that night, you would never have executed your remarkably strategic fall." A hint of mischief, rare and therefore precious, gleamed in his grey eyes, prompting an answering smile from Eleanor. "A fortunate accident, one might say." "Fortunate indeed," he agreed, rising and offering his hand to assist her, though entirely devoid of actual accident. As they walked back toward the park entrance, where Lady Mortimer awaited in the borrowed carriage, Eleanor was conscious of a profound shift in her internal landscape. What had begun as desperate improvisation had evolved into deliberate choice, the charade falling away to reveal something infinitely more valuable beneath. The announcement in Tuesday's papers would now reflect truth rather than calculated fiction. The thought brought unexpected lightness to her steps as they rejoined the fashionable promenade, her hand resting with new confidence upon the Duke's arm. From a distant bench, partially concealed behind an ornamental hedge, Lord Halvan observed their progress with narrowed eyes, his fingers absently caressing the small red book tucked within his waistcoat. The morning edition of The Times arrived at Lady Mortimer's Curzon Street residence with the customary thud of paper against doorstep. Eleanor, awake since dawn, despite the previous evening's late conclusion, reached the foyer before the maid could retrieve it, earning a look of surprise from the sleepy-eyed servant. "I'll take you to the breakfast room," Eleanor murmured, her fingers already unfolding the crisp pages, seeking the society column where their betrothal announcement would appear. She found it centered prominently on the page, the formal wording somehow transforming the reality of their arrangement into something both more official and more surreal. "The Duke of Westmere announces his betrothal to Miss Eleanor Whitby, daughter of Mr. James Whitby of London and Hampshire. The wedding is to take place in June at St. George's, Hanover Square." Eleanor traced the printed words with her fingertip, a curious mixture of trepidation and elation rising in her chest. The announcement made no mention of her father's profession or her modest social standing, omissions that would be noted and discussed in drawing rooms across London before midday. "There it is, then," came Lady Mortimer's voice from the doorway, her substantial figure wrapped in a floral dressing gown, her hair still confined in nighttime papers. "In black and white for all of London to read." She crossed to peer over Eleanor's shoulder, her breath catching audibly as she spotted the announcement. "St. George's, the most fashionable church in London. Oh, my dear girl, it exceeds all expectation." Eleanor smiled at her godmother's enthusiasm, though her own thoughts were more measured. The Duke, Alexander, as she now thought of him in private reflection, had arranged the announcement with his usual attention to detail, selecting the wording that would best shield her from social criticism while establishing the legitimacy of their connection beyond question. "Your father arrives this morning, does he not?" Lady Mortimer continued, summoning the maid to bring tea and toast. What extraordinary timing, to witness his daughter's elevation to the very pinnacle of society. I declare, it quite restores one's faith in divine providence. "Father comes on business matters," Eleanor gently corrected, setting aside the newspaper. "The Duke has arranged a meeting with his solicitors regarding the investment in Whitby shipping." "Business matters," Lady Mortimer waved a dismissive hand. "As if such trifles could compete with a ducal wedding. You must wear your blue silk when he arrives. The Duke clearly favors you in it." Eleanor acquiesced with a nod, having learned that direct opposition to her godmother's sartorial directives inevitably resulted in prolonged debate. In truth, she had already selected the blue silk, knowing it would please both her father and the Duke, a practical decision that required no romantic justification. The morning passed in a flurry of activity. Lady Mortimer dispatched notes to her entire social circle, arranging impromptu calls where she might casually display the newspaper announcement. The parlour was thoroughly cleaned, fresh flowers were arranged in every available vase, and the best tea service, usually reserved for Christmas visitors, was brought out and polished to gleaming perfection. Shortly before noon, a carriage bearing the Whitby shipping insignia arrived before the house. Eleanor rushed to the door, propriety momentarily forgotten in her eagerness to embrace her father after months of separation. James Whitby descended from the carriage with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested such exertion. At 58, his once robust frame had begun to yield to the pressures of business anxiety and advancing age. His hair, previously brown, streaked with grey, now showed more silver than colour, and new lines etched the corners of his kind eyes. "Father!" Eleanor embraced him without reservation, breathing in the familiar scent of pipe tobacco and sea charts that had defined her childhood. "My girl," he murmured, returning her embrace with equal fervour. "Look at you, straight-backed as ever, despite it all." They entered the house arm in arm, Lady Mortimer hovering in the background with barely contained excitement, clearly impatient to begin discussing wedding preparations and social ramifications. "Brother James," she exclaimed, when formalities could no longer be delayed. "You arrive at the most opportune moment. Have you seen the announcement? Our Eleanor to be a duchess. It quite defies imagination." James Whitby accepted the proffered newspaper with a measured nod, his weathered fingers careful, as he adjusted his spectacles to read the brief notice. "Most gratifying," he pronounced, though Eleanor detected a note of caution beneath his apparent satisfaction. "The Duke's interest in our family affairs has been providential." "Providential," Lady Mortimer seized upon the word with religious fervour. "I have said precisely the same, as if guided by divine hand." Mr. Whitby smiled politely, then turned to Eleanor with a more serious expression. "The Duke's solicitor sent word that he expects us at 3 o'clock, my dear. Something about finalizing the investment documents." "Yes, I received the same message," Eleanor confirmed, grateful for this shift toward practical matters. "We should depart by 2:30 to ensure punctuality." Lady Mortimer interjected with a flutter of her hands. "But surely the business aspects are secondary now. With the betrothal announced so formally, the financial arrangements become mere formality." A shadow crossed Mr. Whitby's features. "On the contrary, sister, now more than ever, proper documentation of our business relationship with the Duke becomes essential. I would not have Eleanor's future security dependent upon informal understandings." The statement, delivered with quiet firmness, revealed much of her father's character. His scrupulous attention to detail, his insistence on clarity in all transactions, his determination to protect his daughter, even as she entered a sphere far beyond his own. These qualities, Eleanor reflected, mirrored the Duke's approach to their arrangement, perhaps explaining the unexpected rapport that had developed between the two men, despite their different stations. The solicitor's chambers occupied the ground floor of a respectable building near Lincoln's Inn Fields. The space spoke of established tradition, oak paneling darkened by decades of pipe smoke, leather-bound volumes lining the walls, and brass fixtures polished to a subdued glow by generations of careful hands. The Duke awaited them in a private consultation room, rising as they entered. His greeting was formal yet warm, his handshake with Mr. Whitby conveying genuine respect rather than condescension. "Mr. Whitby, your journey was comfortable, I trust." "Entirely satisfactory, Your Grace." "The roads improve yearly." "Indeed, Though I find sea travel increasingly reliable for certain routes, your expertise in shipping makes you better qualified to assess such matters, however. This subtle acknowledgement of her father's professional knowledge, delivered without patronizing overtones, earned the Duke an approving glance from Eleanor. He had instinctively struck the perfect note, neither ignoring Mr. Whitby's merchant status nor treating it as a subject to be delicately avoided. The solicitor, Mr. Hardwick, entered with a portfolio of documents, his manner suggesting long familiarity with ducal business. All prepared as instructed, Your Grace. The investment structure provides for gradual integration while maintaining the Whitby name and management structure. For the next hour, Eleanor observed as the two men she most respected in the world engaged in detailed discussion of financial matters. Her father, initially reserved, gradually displayed the sharp business acumen that had built his company from modest beginnings. The Duke, for his part, revealed a comprehensive understanding of maritime commerce that clearly surprised Mr. Whitby. "You've studied the Baltic trade routes extensively, Your Grace," her father observed during a pause in the proceedings. "A particular interest of mine," the Duke acknowledged. "The geopolitical implications of shipping lanes have always struck me as underappreciated in diplomatic circles." Mr. Whitby's expression brightened with genuine enthusiasm. "Precisely so. I've often remarked that ministers would benefit from examining cargo manifests rather than merely diplomatic dispatches." The Duke smiled, a real smile that transformed his austere features. "We must continue this discussion at greater length, perhaps over dinner at Westmere House. I have maps from the Admiralty that might interest you." Eleanor watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. The two men were finding common ground, not in their connection to her, but in shared intellectual interests, a foundation far more substantial than mere social or financial alliance. As the final documents were signed and sealed, Mr. Hardwick cleared his throat with professional discretion. "There remains the matter of the marriage settlement, Your Grace. Given the announcement in today's papers—" "Indeed." The Duke turned to Mr. Whitby with characteristic directness. "Sir, with your permission, I would like to discuss the settlement terms privately with you and Eleanor. Mr. Hardwick can prepare the appropriate documents based on our conclusions." Her father nodded, though Eleanor detected a certain tension in his posture, the natural concern of a man about to negotiate his daughter's financial future with one of the wealthiest peers in England. When the solicitor had withdrawn, the Duke addressed Mr. Whitby with unexpected candor. "Sir, I wish to be perfectly clear. The investment in your company stands independent of my personal relationship with your daughter. Should our betrothal end for any reason, though I sincerely hope it will not, the business arrangement remains unaltered." Mr. Whitby's eyebrows rose slightly. "A most unusual provision, Your Grace, but a necessary one," the Duke insisted. "I would not have Eleanor feel that her personal choices are constrained by financial considerations, nor would I have you believe that my business judgment has been compromised by sentiment." Eleanor found herself touched by this careful separation of their personal and financial connections, further evidence of the Duke's determination to give her genuine choice rather than mere illusion of it. "As for the settlement itself," the Duke continued, "I propose the following. A substantial dowry returned to Eleanor in the event the marriage does not proceed, entitlement to the traditional Duchess's jointure and household allowance upon marriage, and a personal trust established in her name, controlled solely by her regardless of our marital state." Mr. Whitby's expression registered surprise at this final provision. "A trust under her exclusive control, without male trustees." "Precisely." The Duke's tone brooked no argument. "Eleanor has demonstrated exceptional judgment in matters both personal and financial. I see no reason to place artificial constraints upon that judgment simply because tradition dictates it." A moment of silence followed this pronouncement. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward the man who so clearly understood that financial independence represented true security for a woman in their society. Not even the most progressive of her father's business associates would have suggested such an arrangement. "You continue to surprise me, Your Grace," Mr. Whitby said finally, a note of genuine approval warming his voice. "I believe we shall deal very well together, both as business partners and, it seems, as family." The word family lingered in the air, transforming the austere solicitor's office into something warmer, more personal. Eleanor found herself blinking against unexpected moisture in her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that two separate worlds, her father's practical merchant existence and the Duke's aristocratic sphere, were merging with surprising harmony. As they prepared to depart, a messenger arrived, bearing a sealed letter for the Duke. He opened it with a murmured apology, his expression darkening as he scanned the contents. "It seems," he said, carefully refolding the note, that Lord Halvern has called an extraordinary meeting of the Baltic Trade Association for tomorrow morning. The agenda reportedly includes matters of ethical concern regarding certain shipping companies. Mr. Whitby's face paled. He means to publicly question our business practices, despite our recent legal victory proving his allegations false. So it would appear, the Duke agreed, his tone hardening. However, as the newest investor in Whitby Shipping, I believe I am entitled to attend this meeting. A smile, cold and precise as a surgeon's blade, crossed his features. And as it happens, I have certain documents regarding Lord Halvern's own business affairs that may prove illuminating in such a context. The implied threat in his words sent a small shiver down Eleanor's spine. She had glimpsed this aspect of him before, the calculated strategist capable of ruthless action when circumstances demanded it. Yet now, rather than finding it disconcerting, she felt a curious reassurance. This man, soon to be her husband, possessed both the will and the means to protect what he valued. I shall accompany you, Mr. Whitby declared, squaring his shoulders with renewed determination. My company's reputation stands on decades of ethical conduct. I will not hide while it is maligned. The Duke nodded approval. We shall face this challenge together, sir. His gaze shifted to Eleanor, softening visibly. Though perhaps it would be prudent for the ladies to remain at home during what may prove a rather vigorous business discussion. Eleanor straightened, meeting his gaze directly. With respect, Your Grace, I believe my presence might prove advantageous. After all, Lord Halvern's animosity stems primarily from my refusal of his attentions. Let him see that his tactics have failed on every front. The Duke studied her for a moment, then inclined his head in acquiescence. As you wish, though I warn you, such meetings can become quite contentious. I am not unfamiliar with contention, Eleanor replied with the ghost of a smile. As you may recall from our discussions regarding Mill's position on liberty. A surprised laugh, perhaps the first she had ever heard from him, escaped the Duke's lips. Indeed, very well then. Tomorrow we shall present a united front. As they parted outside the solicitor's office, the Duke took Eleanor's hand in his, the gesture visible to passers-by yet somehow deeply personal. Until tomorrow, Eleanor, he said quietly. Rest well. I suspect the coming day will test us all. The pressure of his fingers against hers conveyed strength and reassurance, a silent promise of protection and partnership that required no verbal elaboration. Until tomorrow, she echoed, returning the pressure with equal conviction. As their carriage pulled away, Eleanor caught a final glimpse of the Duke standing on the pavement, his tall figure silhouetted against the grey stone of the building. Despite the impending confrontation with Halvern, despite the social scrutiny their betrothal would surely bring, she felt an unfamiliar sensation spreading through her chest, the quiet certainty of having chosen correctly, of paths converging toward a shared destination. The blue ribbon at her wrist caught the afternoon sunlight as she lifted her hand in farewell, the simple strip of silk now laden with meanings neither she nor the Duke could have anticipated when their charade began. From across the street, unnoticed by any of the participants in this tableau, a slender figure in an elegant coat observed their departure, a small red book clutched in one gloved hand, the other curled into a fist of barely contained fury. The Baltic Trade Association maintained offices in a solid brick building near the docks, its entrance adorned with a worn brass plaque bearing the organization's seal, a ship in full sail above crossed anchors. The interior spoke of practical commerce rather than ostentation, plain wooden floors polished by decades of foot traffic, walls lined with shipping maps and tide charts, and furniture selected for durability rather than fashion. Eleanor entered on her father's arm, the Duke walking slightly ahead of them with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding attention in any room he entered. Heads turned as they progressed down the corridor toward the meeting chamber, whispers following in their wake, like ripples behind a stone cast into still water. "The lady has no place here," muttered one elderly merchant to his companion, his voice carrying despite his apparent attempt at discretion. "Trade meetings are not drawing-room entertainments." The Duke paused, turning to face the speaker with Arctic courtesy. "Miss Whitby attends as my betrothed and as the daughter of one of your most respected members, sir. Her understanding of shipping operations exceeds that of many gentlemen present, I assure you." The rebuke, delivered with calm precision, silenced further commentary as they proceeded into the main chamber where rows of chairs had been arranged before a raised platform. Most seats were already occupied, the atmosphere charged with anticipation, unusual for routine trade gatherings. Lord Halvern stood near the platform in animated conversation with several older gentlemen, his golden hair catching the light from the tall windows. As they entered, he glanced up, a smile of calculated pleasantness spreading across his handsome features. "Westmere, how unexpected. I wasn't aware you had developed an interest in shipping matters." His gaze shifted to Eleanor, a flash of something cold and assessing crossing his expression before he masked it with social polish. "Miss Whitby, your presence truly elevates our humble proceedings." Lord Halvan, the Duke's acknowledgement was minimal, correct yet devoid of warmth. "I believe my interest in Baltic shipping was made clear by yesterday's announcement of my investment in Whitby Shipping and Import." A murmur ran through the assembled merchants, many of whom were seeing confirmation of rumors that had circulated since the betrothal notice appeared. Halvan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed, a most fortuitous arrangement for all concerned, though the timing does raise certain questions of due diligence, particularly given the matters to be discussed today." The implied criticism hung in the air like wood smoke, not overtly offensive, yet impossible to ignore. Eleanor felt her father stiffen beside her, pride warring with the pragmatic caution of a businessman who had weathered many commercial storms. "I assure you, Lord Halvan," the Duke replied with lethal courtesy, "my investigation of Whitby Shipping's operations was most thorough, perhaps more thorough than your own inquiries into certain investments currently held by your family's trust." The subtle threat in these words was not lost on those nearest to them. Halvan's complexion paled slightly beneath his fashionable tan, though his smile remained fixed. "We shall see," he murmured, gesturing toward the platform where a portly gentleman with impressive side whiskers was calling the meeting to order. "The proceedings begin." They took seats in the front row, an arrangement that forced Halvan to address them directly during the presentation he had so carefully orchestrated. Eleanor sat between her father and the Duke, her spine straight as a ship's mast, her expression composed despite the tension knotting her stomach. "Gentlemen and lady," the chairman began with a nod toward Eleanor that managed to be both courteous and faintly disapproving, "Lord Halvan has requested this extraordinary meeting to address certain matters he considers relevant to all members of our association. As courtesy dictates, we have granted his request, though I remind all present that formal allegations require substantial evidence." Halvan approached the podium with practiced confidence, a sheaf of papers in his gloved hands, his expression grave with manufactured concern. "Distinguished colleagues," he began, his voice pitched to carry to the furthest corners of the room, "I appear before you today not as an accuser, but as a guardian of our collective reputation. The Baltic Trade Association has, for generations, maintained the highest standards of ethical commerce. When evidence suggests that one of our members may have deviated from these standards, it becomes our solemn duty to investigate." Eleanor watched as he turned a page with deliberate slowness, drawing out the moment for maximum dramatic effect. "I have here," he continued, lifting a document for all to see, "customs declarations from Whitby Shipping that appear inconsistent with cargo manifests submitted to Russian authorities at St. Petersburg." He paused, allowing the implication to settle over the assembly. "Such discrepancies suggest potential evasion of proper duties or perhaps concealment of restricted goods." Mr. Whitby rose halfway from his seat, his face flushed with indignation, but the Duke's hand on his arm restrained him. "Patience," he murmured, just loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. "Let him extend his neck fully before the blade falls." Halvan produced additional papers, each presented with the same theatrical gravity. Furthermore, certain Baltic route schedules indicate unusual delays at minor ports, delays that coincide with reported smuggling activities in those regions. While circumstantial, the pattern is unsuggestive. The assembled merchants shifted uncomfortably, many glancing toward Mr. Whitby with expressions ranging from suspicion to embarrassment. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with rage at the deliberate destruction of her father's reputation, a reputation built through decades of honest commerce. "In light of these concerns," Halvan concluded with false reluctance, "I propose that the association suspend Whitby Shipping's membership pending a full investigation. Such action protects both the association and indeed Mr. Whitby himself, allowing proper examination of these troubling patterns." A murmur of discussion rippled through the chamber as Halvan returned to his seat, his expression that of a man who had performed an unpleasant duty with appropriate gravity. The chairman rose, clearly discomfited by the allegations yet bound by organizational protocol. "Mr. Whitby, as the member in question, you have the right to immediate response before we consider Lord Halvan's proposal." Eleanor's father stood slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the attack on his life's work. "Gentlemen, I have sailed the Baltic routes for 35 years, he began, his voice quiet yet carrying the natural authority of experience. "In that time, I have weathered storms both natural and political, navigated changing regulations, across 7 different governments, and maintained ledgers that any man here is welcome to examine. He paused, surveying the room with dignity that transcended his merchant status. The documents Lord Halvan presents are indeed from my company records, though how he obtained them is a matter I shall address separately. What he fails to mention is their context. From his coat, Mr. Whitby withdrew a leather portfolio. The alleged discrepancies between British and Russian declarations reflect the standardized conversion rates established in the Anglo-Russian Trade Agreement of 1842, which allows for measurement variances between imperial and Russian systems. Every merchant in this room employs the same conversions. Several heads nodded in recognition of this common practice. Halvan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. As for the delays at minor ports, Mr. Whitby continued with calm precision, these coincide with scheduled maintenance of our vessels, maintenance documented in ship logs and verified by port authorities. Again, records any gentleman here is welcome to examine. The strength of this simple defense, factual, verifiable, and delivered without histrionics, visibly impressed the assembled merchants. Eleanor felt a surge of pride in her father's quiet dignity, so unlike Halvan's theatrical presentation. I have spent my life building a company founded on integrity, Mr. Whitby concluded. I will not see that legacy tarnished by baseless insinuations, regardless of their source. As he resumed his seat, the Duke rose in one fluid movement, his height and bearing instantly commanding the attention of every person in the chamber. Gentlemen, he began, his aristocratic accent in stark contrast to the predominantly middle-class voices that had preceded him. I speak not only as the newest investor in Whitby Shipping, but as a member of the House of Lords Committee on Trade and Foreign Commerce. This revelation caused a stir among the merchants, many of whom had not realized the Duke's involvement in governmental trade policy. Having thoroughly examined Mr. Whitby's business practices before committing significant capital to his enterprise, I can attest to their exemplary nature. The Duke's tone carried absolute conviction. Indeed, his operational methods have been recommended to the committee as models for standardized trade protocols. A rustle of impressed murmurs followed this endorsement. The value of ducal approval in commercial matters could scarcely be overstated, particularly from a peer known for financial acumen rather than frivolous expenditure. However, the Duke continued, his voice hardening subtly, I find myself compelled to address not merely the defense of Whitby Shipping, but the nature of these accusations themselves. He turned to face Halvan directly, his grey eyes cold as North Sea ice, particularly given certain documents that have recently come into my possession. From within his immaculate coat, the Duke withdrew a small red leather book, its gilt edges catching the light. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She recognized it instantly as identical to the volume Halvan had flashed during their first encounter, the notorious record of conquests and wagers that had threatened her reputation. Halvan's face drained of color, his customary poise visibly faltering. That is private property, Westmere, a personal journal of no relevance to these proceedings. On the contrary, the Duke replied with lethal precision, this ledger contains detailed records of your systematic attempts to manipulate markets through the spread of false information about commercial rivals. Specifically, he opened the book to a marked page. It documents your wager of £500 with Lord Pennington that you could destroy Whitby's Baltic trade through strategic rumour by the end of this quarter. A shocked silence fell over the assembly. Such deliberate commercial sabotage violated not only the association's ethical standards, but potentially the law itself. Furthermore, the Duke continued relentlessly, it records similar wagers regarding 3 other companies represented in this room, each followed by campaigns of whispered allegations remarkably similar to today's performance. Several merchants rose half out of their seats, expressions of outrage replacing their earlier discomfort. The chairman rapped sharply for order, his face flushed with anger. These are serious allegations, Your Grace. The book in question, how did you obtain it? It was provided to me by a former associate of Lord Halvan's, a gentleman who found his conscience troubling him after witnessing the destruction of several reputable businesses. The Duke's gaze remained fixed on Halvan, who had risen from his seat, his handsome face contorted with fury. This is absurd, Halvan sputtered, abandoning his careful composure. A fabrication designed to discredit legitimate concerns. The handwriting matches your signature on official association documents, the Duke interrupted coolly, and the seal pressed into the leather matches your family crest. I have had both verified by experts from the Foreign Office. Eleanor watched the scene unfold with mingled shock and satisfaction. The Duke had clearly been preparing this counterattack with meticulous care, gathering evidence and waiting for precisely this moment to deploy it. "I move," declared an elderly merchant who had risen to his feet, his voice quavering with indignation, "that it is Lord Halvern, not Whitby Shipping, whose association membership should be suspended pending investigation. Such deliberate market manipulation violates every principle of honourable commerce." "Seconded," called several voices in unison. The chairman, clearly shaken by this unexpected turn of events, nodded gravely. "The motion is properly presented and seconded. All in favour?" A forest of hands rose throughout the chamber. Halvern, his face mottled with rage and humiliation, lunged toward the Duke with fists clenched. "You orchestrated this," he hissed, abandoning all pretense of gentlemanly conduct. "You and that merchant's daughter." The Duke's hand shot out, grasping Halvern's wrist with enough force to stop his advance. "Consider very carefully," he said, his voice pitched for Halvern's ears alone, "whether you wish to compound today's disgrace with an assault witnessed by the entire Baltic Trade Association." For a moment it seemed Halvern might disregard this warning. Then, as suddenly as it had erupted, his fury seemed to collapse inward. He wrenched his arm free, straightened his coat with shaking hands, and faced the assembly. "I withdraw my allegations against Whitby Shipping," he announced, his voice brittle as thin ice, "and I resign my membership in this association, effective immediately." Without awaiting response, he strode toward the exit, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. At the doorway he paused, turning back to direct one final, venomous glare at Eleanor. "This isn't finished," he said, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "There are other ways to settle accounts." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a decisive click that seemed to punctuate the end of his influence within the mercantile community. A collective exhalation swept through the chamber, tension draining like air from a punctured balloon. The chairman cleared his throat. "In light of these extraordinary developments, I believe we may consider Lord Halvern's proposal withdrawn and the matter closed." He turned toward Mr. Whitby with a respectful nod. "The association extends its apologies for any distress these unfounded allegations may have caused, sir." Mr. Whitby acknowledged the apology with quiet dignity. "I have always valued the association's commitment to ethical standards. Today's proceedings reaffirm that commitment." As the meeting dissolved into small groups of animated discussion, the Duke offered his arm to Eleanor. "I believe we have accomplished what we came for," he said quietly, "though Halvern's parting threat suggests continued vigilance would be prudent." "You anticipated this confrontation," Eleanor observed as they made their way toward the exit, her father following close behind. "The book, you've had it for some time, haven't you?" A ghost of a smile touched the Duke's lips. "Since the day after our first meeting. I made inquiries among certain gentlemen who had observed Halvern's methods in the past. The book itself was liberated from his club by an associate with gambling debts Halvern had been using as leverage. I merely provided the means to settle those debts in exchange for the evidence." "A calculated strategy," Eleanor murmured, impressed despite her distaste for such intrigue. "You were preparing for this battle before we even established our arrangement." "I prefer to enter conflicts with adequate ammunition," he replied simply. "Halvern's treatment of you that night marked him as an adversary. The rest followed naturally." Outside, spring sunshine had broken through London's perpetual haze, bathing the street in unexpected warmth. Their carriage awaited, the Duke's crest gleaming on its polished door. As Mr. Whitby joined them, his expression reflected mingled relief and lingering concern. "That parting threat," he said quietly. "Halvern is not a man to accept defeat gracefully." "No," the Duke agreed, his expression hardening, "which is why I've taken the liberty of arranging additional security at Westmere House and at your Curzon Street residence, Eleanor. Until the wedding, Halvern remains a potential source of mischief." The wedding, the word hung in the air between them, transformed now from strategic fiction to imminent reality. Eleanor found herself studying the Duke's profile as he handed her into the carriage, the strong line of his jaw, the intelligent grey eyes, the mouth that had begun to smile more frequently in her presence. What had begun as calculated alliance had evolved into something she scarcely dared name, even in the privacy of her thoughts. As the carriage pulled away from the Baltic Trade Association building, Eleanor caught sight of a familiar figure watching from across the street. Halvern, his normally immaculate appearance somewhat disheveled, his expression dark with barely contained fury. Their eyes met briefly through the carriage window, and the malice in his gaze sent a chill through her despite the spring warmth. The Duke, following her line of sight, reached across to close the curtain with a decisive gesture. "He is finished in respectable commerce," he said quietly. "His family will likely recall him to their country estate until the scandal fades. Yet you've arranged additional security." Eleanor noted, unable to dismiss the memory of that hate-filled gaze. A precaution only. The Duke's hand covered hers where it rested on the seat between them, his touch conveying reassurance more effectively than words. "I protect what is mine, Eleanor. And you, whether by arrangement or affection, most certainly are." The simple declaration, delivered without flourish or romantic embellishment, nonetheless sent warmth spreading through Eleanor's chest. It was, she realized, as close to a declaration of love as this controlled, precise man was likely to express, yet somehow more meaningful for its restraint. As their carriage navigated the crowded London streets, Eleanor found herself contemplating the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperate stratagem to genuine attachment, from calculated risk to chosen commitment, a transformation as unexpected as it was profound. The blue ribbon at her wrist caught the sunlight filtering through the carriage window, its simple weave now laden with significance beyond its modest appearance. Like their relationship itself, it had become a symbol of something neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed on that fateful evening outside Berkeley Square. 3 weeks later, St. George's, Hanover Square, blazed with candlelight and flowers, its austere grandeur softened by arrangements of spring blossoms at the end of each pew. The guest list, personally revised by the Duke, included an unusual mixture of aristocratic connections and merchant families, a deliberate statement that set tongues wagging throughout fashionable London. Eleanor stood in the small antechamber, her father beside her, both silent in the last moments before the ceremony. Her gown, ivory silk with delicate lace at the bodice and sleeves, had been created by the Duchess's own modiste, another statement of acceptance into a world previously closed to her. "You're certain, my dear?" her father asked quietly, his weathered hand covering hers where it rested on his arm. "Even now there would be no shame in—" "I am certain," she interrupted gently, meeting his concerned gaze with steady confidence. "What began as strategy has become something else entirely." Mr. Whitby studied his daughter's face, seeming to search for any hint of doubt or reservation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "He is a better man than I initially believed," he admitted. "His actions at the Baltic trade meeting revealed character beyond mere nobility of birth." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, her voice soft with an emotion she had finally allowed herself to acknowledge, "though I believe I glimpsed that character from our first true conversation. It simply took time to fully reveal itself." The music swelled from within the church, their cue to proceed. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself for the scrutiny that awaited. Society would watch her every movement, searching for evidence that she was unworthy of the position she was about to assume. "Ready?" her father asked, adjusting her veil with tender hands. Eleanor nodded, her fingers touching the blue ribbon that had been incorporated into her bouquet, the final evolution of the simple token that had marked each stage of their unexpected journey. The great doors opened, revealing the path to the altar where Alexander stood waiting, his tall figure commanding in formal attire, his expression solemn yet touched with something that might, to those who knew him best, resemble joy. "Yes," she whispered, as much to herself as to her father. "I'm ready." The gardens of Westmere House stretched toward the horizon, formal arrangements nearest the manor gradually yielding to more natural landscapes as they reached the estate's boundaries. June roses bloomed in carefully tended beds, their scent carrying on the warm summer breeze that rustled through ancient oaks at the garden's edge. Eleanor sat at a small table positioned to capture both shade and view, papers spread before her, a teacup cooling at her elbow as she focused on the correspondence demanding her attention. After 3 months as Duchess of Westmere, she had established routines that balanced her new social responsibilities with continued involvement in matters that interested her, including the management of her personal trust and certain aspects of Whitby shipping. The sound of approaching footsteps caused her to glance up from her work. Alexander crossed the terrace with his characteristic measured stride, a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm, his expression warming visibly at the sight of her. "Diligent as always," he observed, taking the seat opposite hers, "though I believe you promised Lady Mortimer you would review the guest list for next month's garden party." Eleanor smiled, setting aside her pen. "Completed an hour ago. I'd been examining the quarterly reports from Father's Baltic routes instead. The Russian trade minister has finally approved our new shipping schedule." "Excellent news." Alexander placed the portfolio on the table between them, which coincides well with these. Curiosity piqued, Eleanor opened the leather case to reveal a sheaf of official-looking documents bearing governmental seals. "The Trade Commission report? Just delivered from London." Pride colored his voice as he watched her scan the pages. "Your father's recommendations regarding standardized declaration procedures have been adopted in full. They will become policy for all British merchants by year's end. Eleanor's eyes widened as she read further. They've named it the Whitby Protocol. Father must be ecstatic. I believe his exact words were, cautiously satisfied, Alexander replied with a hint of amusement. Though the letter that accompanied these documents suggested he might permit himself a glass of port in celebration, the thought of her father's understated reaction to this extraordinary vindication brought a surge of affection to Eleanor's chest. In the months since the confrontation at the Baltic Trade Association, his company had flourished under the combined influence of the Duke's investment and the removal of Halvan's malicious interference. The shipping line now operated routes throughout the Baltic and North Sea, with plans to expand to Mediterranean ports by year's end. He deserves this recognition, she said softly, after all he endured from Halvan's campaign. Alexander's expression hardened slightly at the mention of their former adversary. Halvan remains in France, according to my sources. His family has apparently made his exile a condition of continued financial support. Good. Eleanor's tone held no sympathy for the man who had nearly destroyed her father's reputation and had threatened her own. May he remain there indefinitely. A comfortable silence settled between them as Eleanor returned the documents to their portfolio. Such quiet moments had become precious in the whirlwind of their new life together, islands of peace amid the constant demands of their position. As Duchess, Eleanor found herself at the center of social obligations that would once have seemed overwhelming, yet with Alexander beside her, even the most intimidating gatherings had become navigable. I received a letter from Hampshire this morning, Alexander said after a moment, his tone deliberately casual. The boy's schoolmaster reports significant progress in mathematics and natural philosophy. Eleanor nodded, recognizing his reference to Lady Caroline's son, the child he had protected and provided for despite no biological connection. They had discussed the boy during their courtship, Alexander sharing the full story of his promise to his dying friend and his determination to ensure the child's welfare without the stain of illegitimacy. Perhaps he might visit during the summer holiday, she suggested, meeting her husband's surprised gaze with steady certainty. The estate would provide ample opportunity for a boy interested in natural philosophy. The collections in the library alone would occupy him for weeks. Alexander studied her face, something like wonder softening his features. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor. Most women in your position would prefer to maintain distance from such complications. I am not most women, she reminded him with a small smile, as you have noted on several occasions. Indeed not. He reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb tracing the circle of his ring where it adorned her finger, a fact for which I find myself increasingly grateful with each passing day. The simple gesture, intimate yet restrained, characteristic of their private interactions, sent warmth spreading through Eleanor's chest. Their marriage, begun as strategic alliance, had evolved into a partnership deeper and more satisfying than either had anticipated. While society might have expected grand romantic gestures from a new husband, Alexander expressed his growing attachment through more subtle means, seeking her opinion on matters of business and politics, ensuring her financial independence despite their marriage, defending her against lingering social criticism with unwavering loyalty, and occasionally, in rare unguarded moments, looking at her as he did now, with an expression that transformed his austere features into something almost vulnerable in its honesty. The trustees for the Baltic Trade Widows and Orphans Fund will arrive tomorrow, Eleanor said, gently shifting the conversation as she sensed his discomfort with such naked emotion. I've had the blue guest rooms prepared and arranged for tea in the library, so you might show them the shipping maps. Alexander nodded, visibly grateful for the return to practical matters. The fund had been his creation, established in the wake of Halvan's disgrace to provide for families of sailors lost at sea, another quiet act of decency that had earned him respect in mercantile circles, previously suspicious of aristocratic involvement. Your father will join us? He inquired, releasing her hand to pour fresh tea from the pot that had been left warming beneath a cozy. Yes, though he insists on staying at his club rather than here. He claims Westmere House is too grand for a simple merchant's habits. A rare smile crossed Alexander's features. Yet he had no such reservations about advising my steward on improvements to the home farm's accounting methods. The man has reformed our agricultural bookkeeping entirely. Father has always preferred utility to grandeur, Eleanor agreed, accepting the cup he offered. A preference I find myself sharing despite my new circumstances. Alexander studied her over the rim of his own cup, his grey eyes thoughtful. Do you regret it, Eleanor? This life you've accepted? The question, coming after months of marriage, caught her by surprise. Regret? No. though I sometimes marvel at the path that led us here." Her fingers touched the blue ribbon that she still wore around her wrist, now complemented by the ducal diamonds that circled her opposite arm. From pretended fall to genuine charm contentment, the careful choice of word did not escape his notice. "Mere contentment?" he inquired, a hint of challenge in his tone. Eleanor met his gaze directly, allowing herself a rare moment of complete openness. "Happiness, then, though the word seems inadequate for what has grown between us." Something in Alexander's expression shifted, the careful control he maintained in all things momentarily suspended. He rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his, a gesture so uncharacteristic of his usual reserve that Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless. "I have never been a man given to poetic declarations," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of long-considered truth. "My nature tends toward calculation rather than romantic impulse, yet I find myself increasingly transformed by your presence in my life. What began as strategic alliance has become essential to my happiness in ways I could not have anticipated." The admission, as close to a declaration of love as this controlled, precise man was capable of making, touched Eleanor more deeply than any flowery profession might have done. Its very restraint spoke to its sincerity, to the fundamental honesty that had drawn her to him despite their unlikely beginning. "I fell at your feet by design," she replied softly, her fingers tightening around his, "yet find myself by your side by choice. Perhaps strategy and sentiment are not so incompatible after all." Alexander raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm with uncharacteristic demonstrativeness. "A conclusion worthy of Mill himself," he murmured, the rare spark of humor in his eyes complementing the undeniable tenderness in his touch. As the summer breeze carried the scent of roses across the terrace, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The blue ribbon at her wrist caught the afternoon sunlight, a simple token transformed by circumstance into something far more meaningful than its humble origins would suggest. Like the woman who wore it, the ribbon had transcended its initial purpose through a combination of necessity and choice, becoming a symbol of possibilities neither she nor the Duke could have imagined when first their paths crossed on that fateful evening outside Berkeley Square. Her calculated fall had indeed changed her fate, though the true transformation had come not from the act itself, but from the remarkable man whose reaction had set them both on a path neither had anticipated, yet both now embraced with quiet, profound certainty. Sometimes what begins as calculation can blossom into genuine connection. Eleanor's pretended fall, a desperate act of self-preservation, led to a union far more authentic than either she or the Duke could have imagined. Their story reminds us that life's most meaningful relationships often come from unexpected beginnings, and that true character reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in consistent actions and quiet integrity. Enjoyed She Fell Near the Duke? Subscribe to our channel for more captivating historical romances delivered weekly. Each story brings unique characters facing impossible odds and finding love against all expectations. Drop a comment below sharing your favorite moment between Eleanor and Alexander. Was it the library conversation, the opera revelation, or perhaps their final garden scene? Your engagement helps our community of romance lovers grow.